On a beautiful full moon night, we see several warriors pointing their spears upward. Their leader, who stood at the front of the entire army, orders his companions to go and kill that demon. Thus, they all begin to ride, and on the other side, a person stood before those enemies. A boy with white hair with several eyes on his back that looked like wings charges toward all those knights. He approaches the leader, leaving him in shock, who immediately orders his comrades to attack the boy. The boy uses a black energy to tear that poor leader into pieces. The boy continues his massacre, striking those warriors multiple times with his hand enveloped in dark energy. Our protagonists seem to be effortlessly annihilating numerous humans. The boy even creates a purple fire, which spreads across the ground, burning the knights. He continues and even summons multiple portals from which dark masses like octopuses emerge, grabbing the warriors. The protagonist, even weakened by fighting a massive army of people, still remains alive. Nox continues battling, but from exhaustion he kneels while we see 3 demonic eyes on his back. We can also see the appearance of this boy who had white hair and a sad expression. The young man, while holding his sword, tries to rise to his feet and return to the battle. As he stands up, the boy notices something beside him and looks in that direction. Someone dressed in gray armor seems to recognize that demon. A red-haired girl comments that it made no sense for the young man to have made that choice. She states that the boy with white hair had betrayed his group and questions why he had allied himself with evil. Finally, she calls our protagonist Nox von Ranharber. The boy, even with the appearance of that young woman, suddenly remains still, holding his sword. Upon hearing the word betrayal, he repeats it, becoming somewhat pensive. Choosing not to respond to that, the young man simply says with a smile on his face that she could consider it as betrayal. However, he responds that he did not betray anyone first. Rather, it was his friend and his group who had betrayed him. The young woman, on the other hand, says that this is a lie and questions what he was talking about and why he was acting that way. Even so, the boy keeps a smile on his face, and before he could respond, he asserts that he was forced. We go back in time and see a system screen stating that someone completed the first part of Inner Lunatic. The person watching this was a boy playing on his computer, and we see that his room was completely messy. He was happy because this time he managed to get several items and some achievements too. However, the young man mentions that he thinks he won't be able to play that game next month. 2 years ago, we see an ultrasound of someone's brain. The doctor tells the patient Yu-chan that he should stay calm and listen carefully to something. We then see our protagonist with a completely devastated expression as if he had received the worst news in his life. Sometime later, we see the hospital where the boy was. He seemed downcast while holding a paper in his hand. Back to the moment when the doctor was saying something, the man states to Yu-chan that after the exam, he checked the boy's records. He also says he couldn't provide any other answer and that all he could do was prescribe pain medication for now to help Chan endure that pain. Suddenly, we see a box of medicine falling to the floor and someone sitting in a computer chair. Yu, who was that person, was thinking that it had already been 2 years since that event when he received that diagnosis. Looking to the side, the boy sees that next to his dresser was a pile of trash. He begins to cough as if feeling something terrible. Looking at his hand, our protagonist sees droplets of blood on it and says that in the end, it really seemed like he would die soon. Yu-chan also says that no matter where he went, the answer was always the same, and that disease was indeed going to kill him. Suddenly, Chan moves to his computer dresser and picks up his cell phone. He sees a notification on his smartphone and tries to unlock it. The boy looks through some conversations with someone and thinks that he had no one to call. Yu also says that in the end, no one cared about him and he had no one to spend his last days with. Holding the blood-stained tissue, our protagonist comments that in reality, he couldn't even go out and have fun in his current state. However, suddenly the boy sees a series of papers on top of his dresser. We see that the illness he had was terminal cancer, and those are various pamphlets promoting falsely miraculous treatments. However, the boy, irritated, crumples everything and begins to throw it in the air. Frustrated, Yu starts sweating in anger and crying as he looks at his computer screen. We see that a game called Inner Lunatic was open on the PC, while Yu says it's the only thing he has to do. The young man begins to create a new save in that game and make a new character. Trying to distract himself from his pain, the boy wonders what kind of character he should make this time. He considers some options like being a sensitive genius of magic or a genius of swordsmanship and martial arts. However, the game system notifies him that a penalty is given to the character for choosing 2 genius traits and that to remove it, he should choose only 1. We then see that the negative trait his character had was a time limit. The young man, seeing this, remains silent, simply staring at his computer screen. Chan says that, just like him in real life, his character also had limited time. Finally, the system asks if the boy would like to start the game with the character created, and he finally accepts. Suddenly, something appears behind him, and the boy begins to feel a terrible sensation. Our protagonist starts to lose his balance and eventually falls from his chair. Yu-chan supports himself on the desk as he tries to use his last bit of strength to stand up, thinking he couldn't believe he was going to die at that moment. Suddenly, the system appears in real life and informs that the character creation was successful, and meanwhile, Yu says he knew his death was really close. However, he at least wanted to choose the way he would die, and at that moment, the screen informs that the character's name was forcibly changed. A process called synchronization begins loading, and suddenly, we see a beautiful balcony of a gigantic house. The synchronization is finally complete, and Yu-chan begins to awaken in a new body with white hair lying on a bed. Startled, the young man suddenly gets up, confused by the entire situation. As he gets out of bed, the boy thinks that, for some reason, he had a familiar feeling flowing throughout his body. Confused, he begins walking around the room, but suddenly stops and says he just had a hunch. Looking at himself in the mirror, the young man sees a scene that he simply can't believe. He states that he was in that game he played so much, and looking at his face, he realizes he was Nox, a crazy character from the game. The narrator begins to explain that Nox von Reinharber is one of the 3 masters of darkness in Inner Lunatic. This young man was born into one of the richest families in the world of Lunatic and is the youngest of the 5 Reinharber siblings, with a family legacy of generations of sword and magic geniuses. However, Nox was the only one in the entire family without any talent. Being born without either of these talents, he grew angry at the world and eventually formed an alliance with demons, making him the greatest disaster in Lunatic's history. The young man begins to touch his own face, trying to see if he really was Nox or if it was all a dream. Suddenly, a system appears behind him with some information about Nox. He simply can't believe he's seeing a status window right in front of him. But upon closer inspection, he realizes it's all a bunch of nonsense and becomes completely frustrated. Yu also looks at his negative traits and sees that he had many of them. The boy, furious, realizes this is the character he had created earlier before coming to that world. Our protagonist also notes that one of his negative traits was the time limit, meaning he would also die a year sooner or later. For some reason, the young man says he can't quite remember why, but looking at it, it seems quite obvious, and he thinks he wanted a character that resembled him in that game. Chan explains that with nowhere to escape, for someone whose only fate is death, he just wanted to feel represented in the world of Inner Lunatic. But of course, he never imagined a character like this could bring disaster to that world. Suddenly, the system states that Yu has an unread message in his inbox, and the boy clicks to read it. The screen begins speaking to the boy and calls him Yu-chan. However, it says it should call him Nox now. Due to his confused memories, the young man can't remember if that name Yu-chan was really his. He thinks he doesn't know if his parents are alive or dead, and all that remains is the name they gave him. Our protagonist processes this information and realizes that was the name he used before coming to this body. The message now says that Yu-chan probably doesn't remember him, but there was something he wanted to say. Right after, it says it's been a long time, and seeing this, the boy becomes confused. The message also mentions that the last 2 years must have been difficult for the young man, and that he deserved to at least come to this place and live. Then suddenly, the person on the other side, through the system, welcomes Yu-chan back to that world, leaving him perplexed. Our protagonist becomes immersed in his thoughts, trying to understand that he was truly no longer in his world and that, moreover, this place was his new reality. Even so, the person behind the system responds to Yu that although there was much about his identity that couldn't be revealed, they'd wanted to help the boy as much as they could. Reading this, our protagonist is confused, unable to understand who this person was. The system asks the young man to enter the Eldine Academy, build strength there, and try to follow the main storyline of Inner Lunatic as much as possible. Then all the truth will naturally be revealed. However, upon hearing this, the young man feels very scared. First, he hits his own head and says he's going to try to understand everything that happened. The first thing was that he was born as the final boss of the game Inner Lunatic, and in addition, he was supposed to follow the main story. Yu states that no matter how he interprets it, it only means he's eventually going to die. However, even if Inner Lunatic has indeed become his reality, that doesn't mean he's going to give up on regaining his memories. Chan says that no matter the cost, he's going to follow the main storyline, and like his lost memories, he's going to discover what he's doing in that world. And finally, he's going to survive, no matter what it takes. Moreover, the boy mentions that for the sake of this, he was willing to become a true villain according to what he believed. The young man then says that now that he's stopped to think, not much has changed compared to his old life. Since 2 years before losing his memories, he was already terminally ill. At every moment that passed meant one step closer to death, and beyond that, he wasted his life living in fear of when he would die. And the only thing that changed was the setting. This setting changed to a world he knew better and understood almost everything about. Finally, the young man asks the system what day it was today. He receives the news that it was February 4, 1812. The young man then says this means he didn't have much time, and this leaves him somewhat anxious. But even so, with a fiery resolve, the young man declares he's going to begin his 28th attempt to clear that game. Our determined protagonist moves to open his bedroom door. However, something happens to his wrist. A pain leaves the young man confused, hindering him from performing that action. The system informs him that the negative condition has been activated and, due to the effects of constant ailment, Nox had developed wrist inflammation. After leaving his room, the young man questions himself about what the hell was wrong with that body and wonders if it was really that fragile. Suddenly, he bumps into a young and beautiful girl dressed in maid attire. This causes the woman to drop some dishes, shattering them immediately as they fall to the ground. She, confused by the collision, suddenly questions who had done such a thing, but upon realizing it was the young master Nox, she panics. Examining the girl more closely, our protagonist realizes that she was probably Rona. The young woman, desperate, quickly apologizes and begs for forgiveness for committing the crime of harming the Lord. Our protagonist also recalls that despite being a peculiar character, the only thing he remembered was her speaking behind Nox's back. But looking now at the innocent face of that girl, he couldn't believe she would talk behind Nox's back. The young man kneels and says he'll forgive her this time. However, there was something else. With a frightening expression, Nox says that if she made a mistake again, she would be punished mercilessly. Terrified, Rona quickly apologizes and says she agrees with that. Looking around, he notices that everything seemed very quiet, and we see that all the other servants had an expression of fear. They seemed to be in simple shock, confused by the boy's behavior. The young man realizes he forgot he was supposed to be insane, since in the game Nox was like that, and frustrated, he wonders what kind of life the previous owner of the body led. At this moment, Rona asks where the young master was going so early, and he quickly replies that he was on his way to the training hall. All the servants are incredulous at his responses, as they did not expect that from the boy. Right after saying this, he asks his maid Rona to accompany him, leaving the girl in shock, imagining that her master is going to hit her. We then see the two young people walking slowly through the corridors. Up until now, Yu-chan had been silent, only thinking that first of all, he needed to survive. He states that after experiencing the sensation of dying, he had one certainty now. And that certainty was that he really didn't want to die in any way. So to survive, he needed to adapt to his new circumstances as quickly as possible. Suddenly, Yu simply says that this doesn't mean he had no chance, and everything depends on his effort, and Rona, upon hearing her master speak, just seems confused. Our protagonist continues to speak in his mind and thinks that he played that game 27 times and therefore knew most of the hidden aspects of that city. The young man activates his status window as he begins to explain the game's story. Yu informs that the game Inner Lunatic has a story that pits angels against demons alongside the Empire, and this game had a huge fanbase around the world. The special part about this game was the large number of customizations, allowing different players to play with different styles, while lower traits like common and talented could be assimilated multiple times. In most cases, genius traits could only be assimilated once, and using a genius trait makes it easier to reach the top of that world. However, our protagonist only has 2 of them. He also says that in that game there is a concept called trait penalty. With a certain procedure, you can acquire 2 genius traits, but this brings disadvantages. One of these traits was the genius of combat swordsmanship, which grants sword skills and allows the user to reach the pinnacle of fencing. On the other hand, there is the mana-sensitive genius, which increases one's magic skill and makes spellcasting more efficient. He also thinks that there are many other useful traits. One of them is the main character's skill, which allows the user to see other characters' status windows. Another is the Master of Acting, which enables the user to easily deceive people in any situation. There's also the Steel Mentality, which when used in battle, allows the user to regulate their mental strength staying calm. The only problem would be the negative traits, like the Time Limit, which is the worst of them all. Looking at his various negative abilities, the boy sighs, thinking that he was definitely a walking hospital. Yu-chan finally says to himself that for people with a cold negativity, unless the user has a warm ability, it's almost impossible to step into a frozen area. And for constant ailment, he's going to pass out at least once in every chapter. Scratching his head, Yu-chan says he really had no choice and should just take it one step at a time while looking up at the sky. Seeing this, Rona thinks they were almost at the training hall and questions whether that boy really plans to go in there, until something surprises her. Our protagonist was standing still, staring at something, while Rona just watches him. He finally opens the doors of the training hall, thinking there was something he had to do first. We then see the Curse of Weakness, which causes the player with it to have their growth rate halved, so Nox states that he needs to get rid of it. With a sword in hand, our protagonist is affirming to himself that no matter how much he thinks about it, he can only come to one conclusion. Before revealing what that conclusion was, he executes a sword attack, and finally says that the conclusion he reached is that he's screwed. We then see that after just a few swings of the sword, the young man is already completely tired and exhausted. Nox states to himself that it was like reading the beginning of a story and then throws his sword away. The narrator then emphasizes our protagonist, who couldn't even swing the sword more than 10 times, and it's revealed that all of this was caused by the curse. Shortly after, Nox gathers his strength and starts to get up while looking around and thinking that at least he had a bunch of weapons available to him. And the reason for this was that the Reinhardt family's origins began with the sword. He thinks that when it comes to the Reinhardt family among everyone, the best way to describe them would be as the high class of the blade and darkness. The reason this family earned this title was due to the ability to imbue black mana into sword blades to finish off their enemies. All of this was thanks to the commander's blade, also known as the Tyrannical Blade of Darkness, which has been passed down to each family leader. Nox also tells himself that, aside from that fencing, there were several advantages to being part of a noble family, as they held high power and influence in the world. But by far, the greatest advantage of being from that family was the enormous amount of money they had. Happily, he states that money was everything good in that world as he thinks of all the things he could do. Yushan also mentions that his Reinharber family is one of the largest noble families in history, and of course, this means they are extremely wealthy, to the point that even the youngest and most useless son, who was him, had enough money to never need to work. It's as if Nox's father, Theo, didn't care whether his son spent money wisely or not. The boy also notes that, to begin with, Nox isn't that type of character, the youngest son of an aristocratic family. Instead, his archetype and character type was actually quite clear. Nox, after gathering all his strength, manages to stand up again, even with his legs trembling. He states that until Rona brings what he had requested, he wouldn't even be able to run. A few minutes later, we see the maid arriving in the training hall with a cart. The girl tells her young master that the towel, water, and sword he had asked for were ready. But in her mind, she wonders if Nox really plans to exercise since that wasn't like him. The boy asks if there was really no one around, and immediately after, he asks Rona to come over to him. The girl is very frightened, thinking her master was going to hit her. However, the boy doesn't do that, and immediately after, for some strange reason, he grabs his maid's ear. After that, he begins to tell the young woman something we don't know yet. Rona, startled upon hearing everything her master asked, questions when the boy would want to use that money. She also states that all the ideas her master shared with her were trash. However, before the girl can continue talking, the young master orders her to shut up and go carry out what he commanded. As she walks away, the girl thinks that this boy hasn't changed a bit. After seeing her leave, our protagonist says to himself that he doesn't know how fast Rona will be, but she'll probably be there by morning. Nox goes to the small table where she brought the items and serves himself some tea. While drinking the tea his maid had brought, he notes that he needs to figure out a way to resolve that curse and his stamina as well. Suddenly, someone approaches him, calling him by his name. Looking back, the boy realizes it's the head butler, Rodwell die Ernark. He begins to recall that as one of the main administrators of the Reinharber estate. Rodwell isn't someone who can be dealt with lightly. And in addition, Rodwell is the advisor to Nox's father, Theo von Reinharber, the family leader. Trembling, the boy comments that this must be an event he has to face, and immediately afterward he turns around. Nox also notes that Rodwell generally wouldn't care about him and wonders if the man noticed something strange going on. But on the other hand, the boy remarks that he has his own way of dealing with this. The boy activates his master of acting skill and asks the butler what he was doing there, as he should be beside the family leader. The servant promptly replies that after receiving orders from the family leader, he was there to deliver some news to Nox. Ernark explains that one of the news items is that the boy would be able to attend dinner that night. Confused and awkward, our protagonist thinks he hasn't managed to find out anything about that family yet, and even so, he's already going to have dinner with them. To get out of it, he asks the butler to tell his father he can't attend. The butler, in his mind, wonders why his superior wanted Nox at the dinner, and then explains to the boy that the young lady of the Stilliner family had come to visit and train there. And after picturing the girl's appearance, he states that if the young master didn't attend, the family leader would certainly be angry. Sighing and realizing there was no way out, Nox then agrees and says he understands the position he's in. Immediately after, the butler notes that the boy was acting strange that day, and Nox asks what he meant by that. Ernark responds that his young master had never been interested in swordsmanship before, and even so, he was practicing in the hall on his own. Intruding into the boy's life, the butler asks why he's doing this. The boy, changing his entire aura to something aggressive, responds that he's going to make one thing very clear. He orders Ernark not to dare cross the line, being nothing more than a mere butler. With no shame, our protagonist states that what he does or doesn't do is none of Rodwell's business, and that he'll make his own decisions. The man, not seeming to handle this well, still appears somewhat intimidated. He bows before Nox and apologizes for his misstep. Immediately after, our protagonist turns and begins to leave the area. On the other hand, Rodwell wonders if something had happened to that boy and says he'll report this to the family leader. A short while later, we see the beautiful mansion of the Reinharber estate. Our protagonist, who had just left the training hall, was trembling, commenting that it gave him chills since he never imagined an event like that would happen. The boy wonders what would happen if the possession had been activated, but notes that it doesn't matter since it didn't happen anyway. Nox starts to recall who that young lady from the Stilliner family was, whom his butler had mentioned since he had already played that game. Confused, the boy wonders what that girl was doing there, and then we skip forward to the evening. Sitting at one of the tables, a foolish boy begins to mock someone, surprised that person came there to eat. We see that the target of this mockery is Nox, who was sitting there calmly. Moreover, those who were bullying him were the twins Hartz and Alan, who continue to ridicule their poor brother. One of them comments that he never thought Nox would show his face there, and it was unbelievable. They continue mocking the boy, stating that he had made eye contact with the maid and was probably a lost cause. On the other hand, Nox just listens to it in silence and in his mind responds that he didn't do anything. Suddenly, the doors of the hall open and someone important arrives, stating that it seemed everyone was there. This person was Theo von Reinharber, the owner of the entire mansion and fortune. Yu Chan, seeing that man, realizes that he was the leader of the Reinharber family, Nox's father, and in addition, he was accompanied by that girl. The appearance of Talia von Stilliner is then revealed as she introduces herself to everyone in the family with her radiant beauty. The family leader then says that the young lady from the Stilliner family requested night training there and therefore she'll be spending some time in that territory. Finally, Theo Von asks all of his children to welcome the young lady. Our protagonist, seeing that girl, thinks that Talia will be the future heroine of Inner Lunatic, and she's the character who opposes the future villain Nox, and sometime from now, Talia will drive a sword into his chest. Nox's father, seeing his son there, is surprised that he actually decided to show up. For some reason, the tension arises between Nox and the guest, and they finally make their way to the dining room. There, the family was apparently eating peacefully. Nox just stares at his two brothers, who tease him throughout the dinner. One of the twins calls his father and says it's time to decide who will be the next to enter Eldon Academy. And hearing this, Nox finally seems interested. Theo agrees and says it was time to make a decision. Our protagonist explains that Eldon Academy is the most important place within Inner Lunatic. The Academy's students face all sorts of situations and they fight demons there, which is the main story of the game. In his mind, the boy notes that he needs to enter that academy, and moreover, he needs to gather his own allies while keeping most of the original plot structure. Theo then starts a speech, stating that everyone there likely already knows, but the academy only allows 3 individuals from each family. And this is because they want to limit the influence of nobles, and since he already used the first 2 spots for his first and second sons, only 1 entry ticket remained for the Reinharber family. Nox thinks that before making allies, he needs to secure the ticket to the academy at any cost, as that's what the system asked him to do. Theo continues his speech, saying that's why he decided to follow the family traditions, as this had been the method his ancestors used. Immediately, the weak young man with white hair supposes that his father was suggesting a fight among the brothers. Hearing this, the man thinks he never imagined his weakest son would be the first to react to this and is truly surprised by that attitude. Immediately afterward, he responds that the boy was correct and mentions that the fight's date would be in 1 month and they will decide the next entrant through a duel in the training hall. One of the twins suggests that Nox stay quiet to avoid embarrassing himself, and the other responds that weak idiots like him, who have never wielded a sword, don't stand a chance. For some reason, the guest, the heroine, seems bothered by this. In an imposing manner, Nox simply replies while sipping his wine that his brother can only say that after winning. One of the twins becomes irritated and asks if his brother really thinks someone like him could defeat strong people, as he's nothing but a failure. Our protagonist thinks that this duel is yet another event he needs to face to secure the entry ticket. Annoyed with the situation, the boy notes that he's not obligated to listen to those insults and prepares to respond. Proudly, the boy simply states that he will be the one to enter Eldon Academy. Theo, hearing this from the person he least expected, feels a bit incredulous. The 2 twins are completely furious at their brother's statement. Talia, impressed by the boy's confidence, comments that he seems quite certain of his abilities. For some reason, Nox doesn't feel happy with that reaction. In his mind, the boy notes that he's just caught the attention of someone he shouldn't have. Sometime later, we see some papers on a small table in a main hall. Theo, in his office, states that, as the butler's report suggested, there seems to be something different about Nox. Rodwell promptly replies that it's just his opinion, but it seems true. In his mind, Nox's father thinks that if he hadn't seen what happened that day himself, he wouldn't have believed it. The patriarch appears quite thoughtful, wanting to know what caused this change in his son. And considering the worst-case scenario, the man wonders if his son has been possessed by a demon. However, he simply says that the boy has caught his attention and then dismisses his butler. Finally, he asks the butler to keep an eye on Nox. Sometime later, we see our protagonist running around the training hall while a few mates comment on it. They seem completely confused since running is the only thing that boy does. Even tired and exhausted, Nox doesn't seem deterred and continues running. Confused, Yu Chen wonders why he can hear everything the maids are saying. Right after that, the boy's stamina status increases by 0.1. Nox is extremely dissatisfied with that small increase and tells himself that he's running because his stamina is incredibly low. He explains that the condition to use the genius of combat swordsmanship is to have stamina stats above 4, and unless he's as weak as Nox, he should already be able to use it right away. But with the weakness curse in effect, it's taken him a month to increase his stamina by only 19. The boy explains that the weakness curse is a curse that reduces his growth rate by half, and after running so much, our protagonist managed to increase his stamina by 0.1. Additionally, since the time limit trait also halves his growth rate, he has to work 4 times harder compared to others. Still, even with all that effort, thanks to the time limit trait, he can only reach a maximum of 15 stamina, but he says he won't worry about that now. Sometime later, we see Rona once again arriving with a cart and calling for her young master, saying she brought all the supplies he requested. Nox is pleased, as the girl was faster than he expected, and immediately after, he replies that he should be able to make some progress now. We see that on the table Rona brought, there were several extremely unique and strange ingredients for some reason. Confident, our protagonist thinks he's just going to use his knowledge to solve all these problems. Sometime later, we see the 2 inside the training room, and the maid questions why her young master wanted all those things. She notes that the poison is difficult to handle and that people generally avoid such things, and besides, the scroll is the only useful item there. The young man, however, simply replies that it's hard to handle because no one knows the right way to use it. Our protagonist turns and grabs one of the vials on the table to perform something. For some reason, Nox, without hesitation, drinks the poison inside that vial, leaving Rona horrified. Right after that, the boy starts feeling sick and comments that it was indeed lethal. However, for some reason, the system notified him that he managed to increase his health by 15 times, but the death countdown would start soon. The girl then says she's going to call the head butler. However, the boy asks her to stop. After doing this, Nox consumes one more of the strange items on the table, the golem core. Rona becomes even more terrified, and at that moment, the system notifies that the young man will start to petrify slowly. However, the hidden mechanism is activated, and the three-headed Gorgon's poison reacts with the golem core. With this, Nox realizes that his plan was finally working. He explains that originally the golem core was used to petrify people to quickly increase their defense or to create artificial golems. However, when combined with the Gorgon's poison, an effect is triggered, and the negative trait Curse of Weakness disappears. Nox is completely thrilled by this, while Rona remains extremely apprehensive. Even so, the boy tells himself there was still one more step, while his maid asks if he's okay. For some reason, the young man begins to remove his shirt, leaving the girl utterly shocked. Embarrassed, she covers her eyes to avoid seeing the scene. However, she realizes that the boy was reaching for the vial she had brought. Yu-chan pours the dew of the Fairy of Remembrance over his body, causing the petrification effects from the golem core to disappear. The dew of the Fairy of Remembrance also reacts with the core, and as it does, Nox mentions that it brings him a strange feeling. The hidden mechanism is activated, and thus our protagonist temporarily gains the trait Blessing of Evolution, and he's delighted as everything went according to plan. Finally, he notes there's only one more step and moves to grab the scroll on the table. The young man uses it, doubling his stamina growth rate once again. In his mind, Yu-chan thinks he managed to eliminate the curse, and in addition, the Blessing of Evolution is limiting the effects of the time limit trait, along with the scroll. Now his evolution rate should be twice that of most people at this moment, meaning he could increase his stamina stats much faster. The maid, on the other hand, afraid her young master would die, jumps into his arms, embracing him. In tears, she asks if her young master is okay, as what he did was madness. She says that the boy started taking off his clothes out of nowhere, and she thought something was wrong with his head. But, ignoring Rona, the only thing Nox asks for is a towel. Even so, Rona isn't entirely satisfied and continues shedding tears. Our protagonist thinks that since the curse has been removed, maybe he should go easier on his maid. Yu-chan then tells the girl he's fine, and Rona asks if he's sure he'll be okay even without her calling the head butler. The boy gives a slight smile and explains that everything is fine, and Rona asks what he's going to do. With his plan all set, the boy simply responds that he's going to run as much as he can. Sometime later, we see the sun illuminating the beautiful Rhine Harbor mansion. As usual, Nox is running incessantly to improve his stamina stats. Rona isn't resting either and is right behind him carrying a towel to dry him off. For some reason, someone is watching them run from a distance. It's revealed that the person watching is Talia, who wonders how someone as weak as Nox accepted a duel against his brothers. Talia's maid, Emma, scolds her and tells her mistress she shouldn't view the youngest Rhine Harbor in that way. She tries to say that it's rude, but Talia gets annoyed and asks to stop being bothered. Talia states that Nox doesn't even know how to hold a sword and all he does is run. The young woman adds that even the other Rhine Harbor knights offered to teach him, but the boy had rejected them all. Finally, she states that in a month that boy will get a beating, and that will be the end of it. In her mind, she says that's certainly what will happen, but something is making her anxious because for some reason, something is bothering her. Talia decides to take action and immediately walks in a certain direction, while her maid Emma tries to stop her, but fails. A short time later, she arrives outside on the training field where Nox is exercising. The boy is sitting, resting from his strenuous run. The red-haired girl approaches and introduces herself as Talia. Confused, our protagonist wonders to himself why that girl came there to speak with him. He questions what she wanted and says he had heard that name before. For some reason, Talia is surprised by that cold attitude and wonders why. Being very proud, the noble girl imagines that Nox was too stunned by her beauty, and that's why he must have acted that way. Shortly after, the girl says she had something to ask and wonders if he could really defeat his brothers. She also states that he couldn't think he had a chance just because he was running like that. It didn't make sense. Feeling like she's the best thing around, the girl declares that if he wanted, she could help him. However, coldly, our protagonist refuses and says he isn't interested and she could just leave. Talia questions how the boy dared to do that since she was only trying to offer him help. Seeing this, Rona says to herself that if he talks like that to everyone, girls are going to hate him. Talia gets angry and bumps into Nox as she storms out, completely furious. The boy is confused by her reaction and states that it complicated everything, while his maid looks at him with disdain. Observing all the characteristics of that girl, the young man says that no matter how much he saw, those talents were insane. He explains that in Inner Lunatic, most adult men have a stamina status of 4, and her stamina status was incredible. Nox also mentions that even though this is nothing compared to the 3 sword masters of the continent or the potential of one of the 4 archmages, she at least had the capacity to reach their level. The boy also comments that Talia might be able to kill some demons with that fire attribute of hers. Nox explains in his mind that the magical fire attribute Talia uses eventually evolves into white flames and in the future is used to burn demonized Nox. That's why, if he could make Talia his ally, the story of the future would change drastically, and he needed to find a way to follow the original story while avoiding death. However, first and foremost, he thinks it won't be possible to be on good terms with the person who will kill him in the future. A month later, we see sunlight passing through the windows and illuminating the Rand Harbor mansion. The one walking around there was Talia, strolling slowly through the corridors. The girl seemed to be extremely thoughtful about something. Talia recalls the moment when the warriors praised her because she learned things very quickly. However, for some reason, the girl feels extremely uncomfortable being praised and having the talent of the still in her family. This brings back startling memories of the day Talia lost a fight to her sister. These memories make the girl pensive, and she grips her sword with anger and fury. Sad, the girl wonders if she could really become a knight. The narrator explains that a knight must never be consumed by greed and should remain restrained, sacrificing for the greater good, and above all, being just. Talia asks herself if that arrogant boy could defeat the brothers who had been training for years while all he did was run. Then, determined, the girl states that Nox wouldn't be capable of such feats. The next day, we see the place where the battle would take place. At the center of the arena stood our protagonist facing his opponent, who was part of his family. In a balcony inside, several nobles were watching, including Theo and Talia. One of the people also watching was Theo's first wife, Cecilia, along with Rodwell. Theo asks his butler what outcome he thinks that duel will have. The young man seems a bit uneasy answering that question. We skip to a bit later after the butler reveals his opinion. And at that moment, the judge asks everyone there to pay immediate attention as he is about to say something important. The judge announces that the official duel to decide who should gain the right to enter the academy would begin at that moment, and he finally starts the battle. Our protagonist's brother doesn't hesitate to charge at his younger sibling, trying to end that fight immediately. Back to the moment when Theo asked Rodwell. The butler then says that, considering the young master's previous performances, Alan was sure he would win. Theo, upon hearing this, says that was also what he thought. But in his mind, Rodwell, looking at his master, wonders if the patriarch was expecting a different outcome. However, he truly believed that young Master Nox had changed, but he still didn't think the boy would win. And finally, he mentions that this would truly be impossible as he watches our protagonist standing in front of his brother. The servant comments that he once also walked the path of a knight alongside the family patriarch. And sometimes the art of the sword can be beautiful, but other times it can be quite simple, as its level is determined by training time and how much people value its craft. Moreover, there was only one way for someone to turn the tables and make the person in front of them kneel. That was having overwhelming talent, which is why the butler wonders if young Master Nox was born with that kind of talent. Suddenly, Theo replies that even while believing in the most likely outcome, the possibility is never zero. And if Nox was born with Rand Harbor blood, he still had the chance of being born with the talent of a sword genius. Our protagonist realizes that his sword and combat genius trait was inactive and questions why he was so unlucky, even with his high luck status. He also mentions that he couldn't reach level 4 stamina, as he recalls the moments he trained and reached 38. Rona, who was right behind him, asks if she really needed to keep chasing after her lord. Our protagonist then replies that it wouldn't be fun if she weren't there since no one else would take care of him. Without any shame, the boy hands his handkerchief, with which he was wiping himself, to the maid, who makes a cute face. The boy wonders if his maid was cursing him mentally, but Rona replies that she wasn't, while she accidentally bites her own lip. Yu-chan, looking at the girl, thinks that all that running must also be improving his ally's stamina. Looking at the girl's stats, he notices that Rona had 45 stamina. Incredulous, the boy questions what on earth was in that family's water, well, since even their maid had more stamina than an average person. Frustrated while looking at his stats, our protagonist complains as after all the hard work he did for a month, he was still weaker than a secondary character. Rona, on the other hand, informs her master that the sun was setting, and that he should rest since the boy's duel was tomorrow. Looking at the sky, the boy wasn't sure if he was ready, as he needed more time. Returning to the present, his brother was calling him. Alan, being the jerk he was, says that as Nox's older brother, he suggests the boy surrender. He continues acting superior, saying that his brother Nox was a disgrace to the family, and that it would hurt to beat him up. However, Nox realizes the boy was just lying. Alan replies that it was obvious and reveals that, in truth, his plan was to give his brother a beating and brag about it to Talia. Seeing he was being underestimated, Nox suggests that his brother Alan shouldn't do that. In his mind, the boy realizes his brother had 8 stamina, and there was no way he could defeat him with what he had at that moment. Confused, Nox wonders what he should do now. But at that moment, the judge declares that this duel serves to determine who will represent the leader's name in the Magic Academy. The judge also declares that regardless of who wins this fight, both must accept the outcome. In his mind, Yu Chan wondered what he should do, since if he lost here, everything would be over. His journey to retrieve his memories would be lost. Finding out who sent him that message, and most importantly, his life beyond the one-year deadline, would also be ruined, which is why he grips his sword tightly. We then return to the moment before, when the judge gave the signal to start the fight and Alan charged at his opponent. As a way to escape, our protagonist rolled to the side, dodging and evading the imminent strike. Still at high speed, he uses his stopping foot, managing to halt immediately. Alan, seeing that, merely says that his little brother had a bit of luck. Without hesitation, the white-haired boy continues attacking Nox, who thinks that this game has an evident rule. The rule is that when you lose everything, but if you somehow overcome everything, somehow you gain it all. Then at that moment, the boy's stamina increases by 1 point and he realizes his plan was working. Noticing his brother's reaction, Alan questions if his incredible strikes left the boy so impressed. So he continues attacking, saying that few hits will help Nox regain his sense of reality. Facilia, who was in the audience, thinks that all those talks about the change in personality of that little one were in vain and that she worried for nothing. Watching her son beating up Nox, she comments that just like the first two, the third Rain Harbor spot in the academy will be occupied by one of her sons. She calls Nox pathetic, and as she looks at Theo, she thinks that one day that family will be hers, while showing a malicious expression. Theo, who was in the audience, states that he had placed many expectations on his son Nox and wonders if that was as far as he could go. Rodwell, watching the beating, suggests that his master stop the duel as it shouldn't continue because he fears Master Nox might suffer severe injuries. The Patriarch thinks that Alan and Hearts are reasonably talented, but compared to their older brothers, they are merely mediocre. Sadly, watching the fight, Theo says he will have to accept that none of his sons will have the power to dominate everything and place the world under their heel. And seeing that Nox is extremely tired and struggling to breathe, he states that apparently none of his sons will be worthy of the vanquisher. The man then, sighing, begins to rise, saying that he will have to stop the duel. However, at that moment, our protagonist, while defending himself from multiple attacks, receives the stamina he wanted, and finally, the genius of swordsmanship and combat is activated. Alan, seeing his brother's strange expression, questions if the boy finally realized what he had lost. But at that moment, the boy activates the genius time skill and begins to unleash his power. Our protagonist begins to think that someone whose name he couldn't remember once said that a genius and an ordinary person experience time differently. And after activating that skill, he finally understood that time passed like that for a genius. He states that in his new perspective, everything was moving very slowly, as if the flow of time had become several times slower. But it was clear that his new ability didn't automatically make him a perfect sword master, and this ability alone couldn't guarantee his domination of the battle. However, he was no longer a dormant swordsmanship and combat genius. Therefore, everything was resolved, and at that moment, Alan prepares to strike his brother, who is watching it in slow motion. In the blink of an eye, Nox manages to parry the attack and send his brother's sword flying away. Alan is in complete shock, seeing that little genius rebel in front of him. Our protagonist, on the other hand, is extremely excited, thinking that victory is entirely his. After being struck by Nox's weapon, Alan's sword flies far from him, making it impossible for him to continue fighting. Having taken a hit directly to his hand, the young man crouches, irritated by what just happened. Our protagonist tells his opponent that this is fun, while displaying a terrifying expression. Alan is extremely outraged and questions what the boy is talking about. However, he is ignored. Our protagonist, while ignoring his brother, thinks that even so, he couldn't let his guard down. Nox explains that he couldn't get distracted, as unfortunately, his ability only lasted 5 minutes, so he needed to finish everything within that time. The young man then reveals to his brothers that he had been going easy on them until that moment. However, everything was too boring, so he would have to change that. Finally, Nox suggests they end it quickly and asks that the two twins fight him simultaneously. Alan and Hearts are extremely offended by that suggestion from their brother. Without wasting time, our protagonist asks his father for permission to fight both of his brothers at the same time. Theo, who was incredulous at the entire scene he was witnessing, stays silent for a moment as he thinks about it. Roger and Talia were also in disbelief, wondering what that boy was doing. Nox's father, feeling proud, thinks that his son's energy had changed, and it seemed like he had something up his sleeve, so it was worth watching a little longer. The Patriarch, without hesitation, permits the 2-against-1 confrontation as his son requested it of his own free will. Facilia, on the other hand, is not happy at all and tries to question her husband, who ignores her. Immediately afterward, the man declares that the twins should begin their fight against Nox. Alan retrieves his sword, and Hearts questions how that brat dared to humiliate them in front of their own father. However, despite the whole situation, our protagonist appears extremely calm and with a radiant smile. The twins prepare for battle and ask Nox to do the same. Without hesitation, they charge at Nox together and in sync, aiming to end the fight as quickly as possible. However, even alone, Nox, with his new ability activated, manages to defend himself from both strikes. One of the twins tries to instruct his brother to approach Nox from the left. But not wanting to take orders, the young man becomes irritated and tells his brother to shut up. Even receiving attacks from all directions, Nox remains unfazed and continues defending himself. The system notifies Nox that, due to the special effect of Genius Time, his swordsmanship genius proficiency has increased, which makes him happy. Several attacks are directed at him. Nevertheless, he manages to parry them all. The twins, no longer in sync and even arguing, fumble and collide with each other. They distance themselves from Nox, frustrated by the entire situation. Even Talia could no longer contain her excitement and stands up to watch the fight. Nox, pleased, thinks that all the eyes on him were practically questioning how he had changed so much. He even says that his two brothers, who always mistreated him, are now making the same expression. The twins exchange glances as if preparing a plan, but at that moment, our protagonist interrupts, saying he had already warned them. Nox declares that the two should not be distracted during a fight and immediately approaches them. In the blink of an eye, the boy strikes both of his brothers while passing between them. Without hesitation, he continues attacking Alan and Hearts, who begin to step back, completely cornered by his strikes. While attacking, he thinks that, although it was a fight with something important at stake, just wielding his sword made him happy. Relentlessly, he keeps striking his brothers to end the fight as quickly as possible. At that moment, Rodwell, Talia, and Theo are simply astounded by that single boy fighting two people and winning. One of the twins being attacked says that it should be simply impossible, but soon after, he is thrown to the ground. Our protagonist has managed to corner the twins with his strikes, leaving them practically defeated on the ground. And at that moment, Nox's Genius Time ability ends, and the boy stands still in front of his two brothers. Even with the victory, he feels a bit sad that his ability had already ended. The twins' mother tries to call their sons, concerned about them. Nox, wasting no time, asks the judge if the winner had been decided, and the man promptly agrees. Finally, the judge announces to everyone in the room that the winner is young master Nox Ryan Harbor. Alan, lying on the ground, is simply furious with anger. Immediately afterward, he drops his sword, disappointed in his own abilities. Theo just watches the scene, unsure if what he was seeing with his own eyes was truly real. Nox, as clever as he was, looks back at his father to see if he had a proud expression. Soon after, the boy bows and announces to everyone that he will take his leave. Without hesitation, he begins to leave the room with an imposing air. Talia, on the other hand, wanted to try talking to him but only watches his back. She tells herself that she needs to speak to the boy at that exact moment. A while later, we see that the sun was practically setting. After leaving, our protagonist was carrying himself differently, completely exhausted. He looks at his hand and notices it was bloody, supposing it must have been from using the ability for too long. Nox explains that the Genius Time ability has a major flaw and that he receives a debuff status known as Decline if he exceeds the duration. The system notifies that due to receiving the Decline debuff, his life has been reduced by 2 days and 17 hours. Nox then thinks that this is the worst possible debuff as it permanently reduces his lifespan and makes him more susceptible to illness. However, he says he is relieved that the decline didn't happen in front of others, as if anyone else had seen it, his admission to the academy would have been cancelled. The boy seemed a bit lost, but at that moment, Talia arrives behind him to speak with him. As she approaches, she asks if Nox got hurt during the fight, but the only thing the boy does is feel irritated by her presence there. Seeing that he was discovered by Talia, the boy becomes irritated and states that he can't let his father find out about the decline of his ability. Before he could say anything, Talia says she can't believe he accepted the fight with his brothers with such a broken body. Feeling embarrassed, she starts playing with her hair as she prepares to say something. Finally, the shy girl says that she seems to have misunderstood Nox. The narrator explains that the only thing Talia saw in the past month was that Nox never wielded a sword. On the first day, all she saw was him clumsily swinging a wooden sword, and the fact that such a person could win was a sure sign that he was talented. We go back to the moment when Talia was running after the boy, thinking she needed to ask how he trained and got so strong. However, when the duels ended and she saw Nox, she realized the boy had practically injured himself alone. Confused, the girl wondered what was going on. She asked herself why he was like that, telling herself that Nox didn't surpass his brothers because he was a talented genius. Talia states that Nox wasn't the useless person the rumors said he was, quite the opposite, since the boy simply worked hard to win and gave it his all. Back to the present, our protagonist was coughing due to the decline, and Talia approaches him asking if he was okay. However, coldly the boy brushes off the girl's hand, asking not to be touched. In his mind, he admits that over the last 2 years, having been obsessed with games, it was difficult for him to interact well with others. Embarrassed, the only thing Talia does is apologize. But Nox is extremely confused by her reaction. Talia says she didn't know Nox took swordsmanship so seriously since she had heard he was fragile from birth. She then reveals that now she understands why the boy has only been doing stamina training and apologizes for having misunderstood him. The girl also states that acting useless probably wasn't what Nox wanted, since her maid Emma said people can make mistakes like that. Our protagonist, not being used to interacting with people, doesn't know how to respond, as the girl was very honest, just like in the game. He notes that, although he knows Talia has the traits of a knight, she's from a proud and respected duke family, and admitting she was wrong must be difficult for her. The boy takes advantage of this situation and says that if that's how Talia sees him, he asks her, please, not to tell others that he was bleeding. Seeing that it was a matter of pride, the girl simply responds that she won't reveal anything to anyone. Nox is relieved as he probably doesn't need to worry about others finding out about it now. And before leaving and returning to his room, he asks Talia to keep her promise. The young girl becomes quite shy, as if a spark of affection were igniting in her heart. Later, we see the moonlight illuminating the beautiful Rhine Harbor mansion. Theo, who was in his study, says that it seems his guess was correct. Boasting, he asks Rodwell what he thinks of his son Nox's talent. The butler says that at first he couldn't understand why he allowed himself to get hit, but after analyzing enough among the children his age, including all the other young masters, it seems Nox was the best of them all. The patriarch readily agrees and says he doesn't know exactly why, but he felt that Nox still had some talents he was hiding from everyone. That's why the patriarch asks his butler to monitor his son's every move and to do nothing but observe everything Nox does closely. Looking at his hands, the man wonders if Nox had enough talent to inherit the tyrannical blade of darkness. He clenches his fists and affirms to his servant that there wasn't much time left. Thoughtfully, he tells Rodwell that what the boy was doing was of utmost importance to the family. The servant, seeing that his master was truly relying on him, simply bows, saying he will do his best. We move forward to a later time in the room where our protagonist was. The system notifies that he has completed the tutorial mission and that he has accomplished the task of winning his first fight. Seeing this, the boy says that this world has become reality, but the game system is still there, which feels strange. The system then begins to distribute rewards for Nox having completed 2 missions, the first of which is granting him 3 status points to allocate. Extremely frustrated, Nox complains that he ran for an entire month just to increase his stamina by 2 points. Because of this, he feels the system should have given him this reward earlier. Yu-Chen opens his status window, considering where he needs to invest his new points. Finally, he comments that the status he needs most right now isn't stamina, but luck, so he uses his 3 remaining points to increase it. He explains that the reason for doing this is that in the game Inner Lunatic, luck is the most valuable attribute. So Nox decides that now he's going to check if he made a good choice by raising it. Thus, the system completes Nox's rewards, one of which is a voucher for a random gacha, along with a skill voucher. Reading this, the boy is ecstatic, saying he's going to test his luck. The young man activates the gacha and an apparently interdimensional structure appears like a prize-grabbing machine. Seeing it in front of him, the boy remarks that it's very strange. He then uses his voucher to spin the wheel, thinking that when luck is maxed out, the chance of getting an intermediate or higher rank scrolled is 95%. Yu-Chen explains that the basic or lower rank is white, the intermediate rank is silver, and the advanced rank is gold. The highest rank is rainbow, so the boy hopes to get something gold or higher. Finally, the capsule exits the machine and prepares to reveal its contents. A golden light shines, and at last, a golden scroll appears before our protagonist. Upon opening the scroll, the system notifies Nox that he has gained the advanced trait Fear of the Supreme Ruler. The young man, on the other hand, is extremely satisfied, hardly believing he actually managed to get it, and the system shows him the skill information. He explains that the skill has the effect of reducing all the stats of anyone with a total status value lower than Nox by 20%. Extremely excited and happy, the boy simply comments that this is fantastic, and he can hardly believe he got a debuff skill. However, the boy still had another reward from the mission. The system asks if Nox would like to use the single-use skill confirmation voucher. Reading this, the boy thinks that the skill he'll get with it is already decided, as he wants to obtain one of the hidden pieces the Rhine Harbor family possesses. And to acquire this piece, he needs that specific skill. The young man notes that Theo will soon gather all the siblings at the estate, and that's where he'll use it. Thinking about this, the boy also mentions that it was almost time for that person to return to the Rhine Harbor estate. Our protagonist states that it has been a while since the Elden Academy's grace ceremony ended, and probably the second son would return soon. Hitting his head, the boy notes that he'll have to find the hidden piece and deal with Grain, leaving him with no time to rest. The only good fortune is that he probably doesn't need to worry about Talia anymore, as that issue should be resolved. The boy notes that Talia isn't the type of character to break her promises, and she has no reason to approach him again. We cut to a time skip, the next day within the mansion. Nox remarks that this was just a thought he had the night before, but he was completely wrong. We then see Talia standing silently in front of him. Confused, the young man says they already settled everything yesterday and asks what the girl wants. Shy and embarrassed, she simply asks our protagonist to say something. However, the boy seems confused by that statement and asks what she's talking about. She then asks Nox to reveal how he became so strong so quickly. Upon hearing that question, Nox remains silent for a moment. He states that Talia had been secretly watching him the whole time and had seen that he only trained for a month. Realizing she'd been found out and watching Nox walk past her, the girl is shocked. However, she runs after him, pleading for the boy to just tell her how he trained. In his mind, Yu-chan thinks that from what he remembers, Talia is a character who dreams of being recognized by her sister. The boy then turns and says that before Talia asks for something like that or considers how she should train, before all that, she should first reflect on the talent she has. Hearing this, it's as if a door that was closed opens in the girl's mind, making her thoughtful. Our protagonist thinks that he's never comforted anyone before and wonders what he should say. He asks Talia not to compare herself to others as she's been doing, and then he leaves. Silent, the girl just watches as our protagonist walks out of the room. Talia feels extremely shy, thinking that boy just said a cool line and simply left. Afraid, the boy hopes that girl doesn't follow him, feeling extremely exhausted. The young man tells himself that he can't let Talia see him obtaining the hidden piece, as that might lead her to kill him. Gathered there was Theo along with his twin sons, just waiting for Nox to arrive. After joining his family, Nox finally arrives at the Rand Harbor family stable after some time. He thinks that this stable is famous for breeding the best horses on the continent. Rodwell, who had been summoned by his master, approaches. Seeing that everyone is there, Theo states that he is sure everyone knows why they're gathered in that place. He explains that from now on, his children will choose the horse they will keep forever. Hearing this, Nox becomes extremely excited, saying that it was finally time. The boy explains that horses are considered sacred animals both on the continent and within his family. He informs that if someone decides to become a mage or a knight, they must choose a horse when they are young to have a lifelong companion. Furthermore, the Elden Academy teaches horsemanship, and in the other part of the game, there are several massive wars. And if you lose your horse, you must raise another, and moreover, transportation magic is very expensive and horses are a very important means of transportation. Therefore, the boy decides he will choose the best horse possible. Theo then reveals that, as Nox was the winner of the duel, he should choose first. The man tells his son he'll only give him one chance as Nox mocks his losing brothers. As he heads toward the stable, the boy's father says he's curious, wanting to know which horse his youngest would choose. The young man passes by several of the animals, thinking that actually they're quite cute. However, he's searching for a specific one, and finally he finds it. He spots an extremely elegant gray-coated horse. Our protagonist, without hesitation, walks toward it and tells his father that he'll choose that one. For some reason, Alan and Hertz, along with Theo, are extremely surprised by this choice. In a rare act of kindness, Nox's father suggests he pick another horse and says he'll give the boy another chance. Seeing that he'd been given another chance, Nox supposes that his father probably thought the decision was very poor. But he is certain of the opposite, and immediately afterward, he activates the status window of that animal to analyze it. The boy explains that most summoned creatures are divided into ranks, and depending on their evolution, they can increase much more than one rank. This meant that the horse could even reach a high rank, and that's why it was his choice. Moreover, it was an obsidian horse, the rarest type among many others, with its name referring to a type of volcanic rock. The boy notes that if his father knew that, even he would have chosen this horse. However, it's less tempting now due to the negative trait, as many of the horse's traits are deactivated because it has a debuff. It's revealed that the horse's negative trait is a foretold death, and seeing this, our protagonist thinks that, in a way, it's a more annoying trait than the time limit. He finally responds to his father that he will not change his mind and that this is his choice. Meanwhile, the young man tells himself that with his knowledge, he can save this creature. Theo, on the other hand, doesn't understand his son's decision and questions why he would make that choice. The man assumes that Nox is probably projecting himself onto the horse, and in the end, his son is just an emotional weakling, which is disappointing. Irritated, the patriarch simply says he hopes Nox doesn't regret that decision. After saying that, the man turns and begins to leave the area, leaving Hertz and Alan confused. Nox, seeing the scene, can't believe his decision was truly disappointing to that extent. Rodwell then approaches Nox and asks the boy to choose a name for his horse. The animal begins to lick its owner's hand while the white-haired boy wonders what name he should give his pet. He finally chooses Cal and right after crouches down to pet the creature, thinking that was the name he used when playing Inner Lunatic. Amidst the sunset, the boy states that this name was meaningful to him. Sometime later, we see the horse lying in our protagonist's room. The boy thinks that first he couldn't show others what he was going to do, so he brought his horse to his room. He starts staring at the animal, thinking that it was time to do it. Analyzing the creature's eyes, the young man realizes that the animal truly seemed determined to live, and besides that, they were practically the same, and just like Nox, the horse was also fighting to live. Shrewdly, Nox reveals that he knew Rona was spying through the door and asks the girl to respond immediately. However, she accidentally opens the door and falls hard onto the floor, notifying her master that she was there. The girl asks how the boy knew her location, and he says he caught her in the act. He immediately tells Rona to take care of his horse, and the girl is shocked to see the animal on the bed. Rona gets irritated, stating that in the end, it will be her who has to clean everything up, and our protagonist says that it is a sick horse, so Rona should do her best. The poor animal starts lying down slowly while Rona just agrees and says she'll take care of Cal. Nox mentions that this is a bit problematic as what's about to happen will be a big shock. At that moment, our protagonist asks if Rona will really be able to handle what's about to happen. 3 days later, someone can be heard screaming from our protagonist's room. That person was Rona, who was in tears because the horse she had cared for so much, Cal, had died. Looking at the girl, Nox thinks she was crying because Cal had moved on to a better place. Remembering all the things the girl did for his horse, he considers it understandable since she had put in a lot of effort to care for him. In his mind, the boy states that despite everything, he already knew something like this would happen. And recalling the poor animal, the young man remarks that Cal couldn't be saved. Our protagonist walks up to Rona, asking her to stop crying as she was distracting him. However, the girl was still crying. The white-haired boy asks his maid not to worry as Cal would return to his side again. Hearing this, Rona is completely confused and questions if something is wrong with the boy's head. Irritated but trying to stay calm, he simply asks Rona to stand behind him. The young man pulls a scroll from his coat and the girl asks what that is. Nox ignores her and then throws the scroll, which had a symbol engraved on it, to the floor. He crouches down and begins to inject mana into the scroll, which causes a magic circle and purple energy to appear from it. Rona, seeing this, is completely terrified, not understanding anything. Seeing that it's working, Nox gives a small, satisfied smile. On the other hand, the maid questions how her young master managed to use mana, and the boy just thinks that he couldn't control it properly. He states that if Rona continued to distract him, Cal would die for the second time, and this time it would be her fault. Immediately, she falls silent, and our protagonist sharpens his gaze, asserting that he needs to concentrate. Nox comments that he has to do this because he hasn't yet awakened his genius trait for mana sensitivity, and at that moment, the magic circle begins to emit a purple aura. The boy explains that in this empire, it's forbidden to use mana before the age of 15 unless you are a member of the imperial family. Because of this, the imperial family's descendants are more experienced. However, the young man states that he would not give up, as the only thing he could do at that moment was put as much mana as possible into the scroll. While trying to learn to control mana, he feels a faint energy in the palms of his hands, and realizing that it really is mana, the young man is extremely happy. He states that it is interesting, and right afterward, he uses his one-time skill confirmation voucher. Still focusing on controlling the mana in his hands, the boy mentions that he can't afford to make any mistakes because what he's about to use now is black magic. At this moment, the system informs that the one-time skill Necromicron Book of the Dead has been obtained by Nox. Suddenly, a skeletal hand appears, holding a strange book that emits a purplish energy. The boy begins to use it on his course, and the system informs that the target could be revived as undead. Finally, the system asks if Nox would like to use that magic on the animal. Nox explains that within Inner Lunatic, there are two types of beings with the undead trait, and the first type consists of creatures brought back with black magic. The second type includes those brought back to life without an ego and who are born as stronger beings. Nox comments that regardless of the type, they also remain blindly loyal to their master, almost to an extreme degree. However, there was a problem, as there was only one family that revived corpses as undead, and that was Marvis, the Shadow family. The boy notes that although the Rian Harbors are also a Shadow family, they are a family of knights. Marvis, however, are necromancer families. In this case, theoretically, players who don't belong to the Marvis family should be prevented from using this type of skill, but the answer to this is no. Our protagonist explains that by using the one-time skill confirmation voucher, he was allowed to obtain a Necronomicon. And this Necronomicon was an item better known as the Book of the Dead, which allowed him to use the magic the Marvis used. At that moment, several black hands begin to rise from the ground around the magic circle. The hands start to surround Cal, and the ritual proceeds. They continue to wrap around the animal as if trying to take control. Suddenly, our protagonist starts bleeding from his mouth for some reason. Roman is desperate for her young master. However, the boy asks her to be quiet. He continues to imbue his mana into the magic circle to complete the ritual as quickly as possible. However, once again, he spits blood as his mana was nearly depleted. But looking ahead, he sees that Cal was fully reanimated with a strange aura around him. The horse appeared to be alive, though somewhat different from before. Upon receiving the notification that the skill was successfully activated, our protagonist is thrilled. Finally, the ritual is completed, and Cal is revived as an undead. Realizing that his plan had indeed worked, Nox gives a big smile. Rona, who had been in tears, is completely confused by what happened and saddened since her young master was in a bad state. However, our protagonist simply wipes the blood from his mouth and asks his horse to come to him. The animal obeys, and we see that unlike before, the area near his head now had a distinct glow. Upon opening his pet's system, Nox notices that the predicted death trait had been erased, and all of Cal's qualities were active. At that moment, the young man touches Cal's head, stating that he will be his master from now on. Before he could do anything, Cal and Nox sense an approach. Desperate, Rona throws herself forward, embracing both her master and the horse. Our protagonist is puzzled and asks what the girl is doing. However, the maid begins to cry in distress. She says she thought something bad had happened to her young master and wonders how he could use mana so recklessly and how Cal was so careless. However, the horse treats the girl with disdain, and she becomes extremely irritated by this. At that moment, she orders the horse to spit out the food she had given him, and Nox just smiles at the scene. He turns away thinking that the next thing he wanted to acquire was the hidden piece. We skip to a few days later at the Ran Harbor mansion. On a full moon night, for some reason, Nox was running outside his house. The boy was dressed in a cloak as if wanting to hide his identity. For some reason, Yu-chan was holding a white crystal in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. Looking at the two objects, he thought that, compared to the game, that path was not so different. As he tucked a map into his bag, he thought it was good since it led to the second hidden piece of the Ran Harbor family. It was an item he needed to obtain as it was the key to help him counter his negative trait, time limit. The boy walks slowly through the forest as he hears something that frightens him. He promptly grasps his sword, preparing for combat or whatever might come. Seeing that it was nothing, he questions if he was worried for nothing. However, looking at a sign, the boy states that this was no longer the game, but reality, so he needed to be cautious. We see that the sign was a warning stating that this forest was called Mia, and that if young children entered, they could get lost and die. Finally, Nox concludes that he absolutely did not want to die. The system notifies that Nox has entered the forest of lost children, and failure of this mission will result in his death. Nevertheless, without hesitation, he steps into the area. The narrator explains that the forest of lost children lies within Ran Harbor territory and has an entrance that is forbidden. No matter how skilled the guides or hunters are, they would still have trouble finding their way out, and it's a place that makes everyone feel as lost as a child. Our protagonist notes that despite all the stories and mysteries surrounding it, the forest also holds a different significance, because even if a fully grown adult kills a monster, they will not gain any artifacts from it. In other words, adults gain no benefit from going there. And when the person who goes there is an adult, the difficulty of the monsters increases, and in the game, he had died several times there before finding the right way to complete the task. That's why the difficulty of this forest was at least 2.5 stars, since the game's difficulty scaled with stars. The boy also mentions that, in truth, when he played, he tried hard to complete it, even without knowing which items would appear, and in reality, he wanted a specific item. The young man picks up a stick from the ground, wrapping it with something flammable like a piece of cloth to make a torch. Quickly, intelligently, and shrewdly, the boy lights it, illuminating the entire forest, but something begins to react strangely to the torch. For some reason, the torch's flame begins to move in a specific direction, as if guiding our protagonist to a certain place. Finally, Nox concludes that the crucial key to clearing the forest of lost children is the direction of the smoke, as it's what guides the player to the correct location. But to be more precise, he explains that it's not enough to simply follow the direction of the smoke, as that's a trap. Instead, he must go in the opposite direction. He then starts to do something while thinking that, before proceeding, he wanted to take action, as something had been bothering him since he entered the forest. The boy, as if he were going mad, asks how long someone planned to hide and demands that this unknown person reveal themselves right then. Silence fills the forest, and absolutely no one responds to Nox, who becomes quite irritated by this. After saying this, the boy realizes that this unknown being will hide until the end of the mission, and he would have to do something about it. Our protagonist draws his sword and immediately slashes at a nearby bush to reveal the position of this person. In a flashback, we see a girl lamenting that her beauty hadn't worked on Nox, which left her frustrated. It's finally revealed that this girl is Talia, who says she just can't get her head around it. Emma, who is next to her, begs the girl to please stop following young Master Nox around. The woman says that if the girl keeps doing that, she will also get scolded along with her young mistress. Embarrassed, Talia promises to make sure her maid won't be dismissed from the family and assures her that she need not worry about it at all. Back to the present, at the mansion, the woman begins to think that young Lady Talia is talented enough for people to respect her as the next matriarch. Well, that is if young Lady Chell weren't around, and the woman wonders why Talia feels inferior to her own sister and is being so impatient. As she heads to her young mistress's room, the maid concludes that Talia has likely given up on chasing Nox and is now sleeping. However, upon entering the girl's room, she notices that it is completely empty. Emma immediately realizes that the young lady is missing and begins to panic. Trembling, she can't believe that Talia actually went to meet young Master Nox, and so commotion ensues at the mansion. Back in the forest of lost children, we see that the bush that had been slashed is destroyed, revealing that Talia was hiding in it. Our protagonist can't believe that the girl is actually there. The girl tries to act naturally while Nox asks what she's doing. Talia is about to explain, but at that moment, Yu-chan notices something behind the bush. He quickly pulls the girl close to him by her waist and immediately points the torch in that direction. Suddenly, two sharp, furry paws emerge from the forest's darkness. We see that it's a giant gray wolf ready to attack the two of them. The redhead, seeing the scene, can't believe that this forest is actually gray wolf territory and states that she only has a dagger to protect herself. Nox holds the girl by the waist as he shields her from the wolf circling them. The creature prepares to do something but changes its mind and then starts howling to call others. Nox and Talia remain stunned, merely watching the scene. In the moonlight, the wolf opens its jaws to strike. However, Nox gives a small smirk and releases Talia, advancing toward the monster. The young man drops his torch and attacks the wolf with his bare hands. In the blink of an eye, the creature's neck is twisted and it falls lifeless. Talia merely watches, witnessing the poor animal collapse with its body already lifeless on the ground. The girl is impressed, as even though it was a wolf, Nox managed to defeat it so cleanly. Looking ahead, she sees that the boy's body is stained with blood. Irritated, Nox says he thought it was his brother following him but was mistaken, and for that reason, he asks once more what Talia is doing there. Embarrassed, she begins playing with her hair, merely saying it was a nighttime stroll. Retrieving his torch, our protagonist tells Talia not to mess with him, as if she does, he'll leave her there alone. Immediately, looking frightened, she prepares to say something as she grabs Nox's hand. She starts babbling a bunch of nonsense, but in summary, she just says she found it strange that the boy suddenly became so strong, which is why she wanted to follow him. Nox gives a slight smile while thinking that he's now certain of 3 things. Talia thinks highly of him, she's not hostile in any way, and lastly, she's just a kid who doesn't understand how dangerous it is to follow others late at night. For that reason, he comments that since she's one of the main characters, he couldn't just leave her there, so he asks her to follow him. However, the young man makes it clear that in this case, there's one thing she must understand. And coldly, he states that he's not trying to help her, he's merely trying to resolve the situation so it doesn't affect his family in any way. Realizing she made a mistake, the girl simply apologizes for having been wrong. Our protagonist figures that this way Talia probably won't do anything dangerous again. Still, timidly the girl calls Nox and then sweetly thanks him. He's left speechless for a moment, and the girl was about to say something more when she notices something ahead of them. Due to the last wolf's howl, a pack of wolves appears, ready to devour the 2 kids who are now in trouble. Illuminating with his torch, our protagonist sees several wolves in front of him, surrounding and cornering him. Because of the wolf pack, Talia begins to tremble and hides behind Nox. The young man, on the other hand, tells her to move away from him immediately. And in a commanding tone, he states that Talia will get in his way when he uses his sword, so she needs to stand back. The young man thinks that despite the unexpected variables, he needs to focus again and get back to his objective. He comments that this is before the start of the game's events, so there probably won't be any boss. But an elite monster, a lower level one, will appear instead. An evolved form of the Grey Wolf he just killed, the elite Grey Wolf. However, even though he knows his enemy, that doesn't mean things will go well. 2 wolves from the pack charge at our protagonist without hesitation, and he slices through them in the blink of an eye. Nox comments that there are times when everyone must realize they're possibly cornered. Our protagonist stares at the wolf pack, understanding that this time he's cornered, but it's still not the end. More wolves advance on Nox to finish things once and for all. The young man says he'll repeat what he always said back when he played Inner Lunatic, when he was still Yu-chan, and that thing was that he was a damn weakling who never gave up. So at that moment he swings his sword, slashing the wolves still in midair. Seeing this, Talia thinks it's incredible, and she's certain that Nox hasn't shown his full power yet, as his swordsmanship technique is even more impressive. The girl even wonders if Nox had killed a Grey Wolf before, since he seems so familiar with it. However, she remembers Nox asking her to step back, and this makes her thoughtful. Talia believes that Nox probably still thinks she's too weak. However, before she can dwell on it further, something startles her, and Nox notices it too. Looking up at the sky, the young man states that it has finally arrived. We see 2 scarred paws approaching the battle scene between Nox and the other wolves. The elite Grey Wolves have finally come to put an end to the fight. Meanwhile, outside, several people are searching for Talia and Nox, who have apparently disappeared. One of the servants looking for Nox finds some tracks near the Forest of Lost Children, and is certain they're the young master's and Talia's footprints. The butler becomes very concerned, realizing that his young master likely entered the Forest of Lost Children. And upon hearing that Talia may have gone with him, Emma becomes completely desperate. She asks what they're going to do, insisting that they should enter the forest now. However, Rodwell tells her not to be foolish, as that would be impossible. The girl questions Rodwell, wondering why they're just standing there instead of helping their children. Hearing this, the butler reflects that it's a forest that even the Rain Harbors haven't been able to clear yet. In summary, Rodwell explains that there's a reason why, even with their strength, they haven't been able to clear the forest. Only children can accomplish that. With all this, he's left puzzled, wondering why the young master would enter the forest. He comments that he doesn't think the young man was under the influence of any mind controller, as judging by the tracks, he definitely moved with caution. The butler also thinks that there's no trace of anyone breaching the strongest mana barrier of the property. This meant that young Master Nox entered the forest of his own accord. Finally, irritated, the butler admits he was wrong and can no longer deny that this is not the same weak and fragile young master as before. He tells Emma that there's only one way for the 2 to return safely. He mentions that the young master will have to use his wisdom and find a way out of the forest. Emma, in tears, merely looks toward the forest, hoping this will happen. All the servants stop searching and simply wait for a miracle to occur. However, the maid without hope says that she was to blame for Miss Talia's death. Back to the kids' fight, Talia draws her dagger for combat, and Nox thinks that she still hasn't lost her focus despite being scared. Then he tells the girl not to do anything unnecessary, as she could get hurt, and she should just stay out of it. Finally, he orders Talia to save her strength to run if attacked. That way, she'll have a slightly better chance of surviving. But thinking more about it, he says that, in fact, killing an elite wolf isn't that dangerous as it's only 2.5 stars. In the end, he just wants Talia to stay alert and react to her surroundings. Looking at her, he notes that she seems to have learned well, though she's not yet the level where he can rely on her to cover him. Looking ahead, he states that for now, he'll do what he can to win this fight. He activates his skill Genius Time and remarks that he'll use this skill to kill all the wolves at once. However, one of the creatures seems to remain in real time, which startles Nox. With his skill activated, he can't believe that Wolf truly is different from the others. One of the creatures then lunges at Nox to try and kill him. But with his new skill, he quickly counters and ends the wolf's life. The others immediately stop and begin to tremble in fear, which leaves Nox extremely puzzled. The leader of the elite wolf pack seems to just stand there, watching the fight with excitement. Finally, the other wolves snap out of their frozen state and charge at Nox together. With great skill, he manages to slice the first one in two. One of the wolves behind him rushes to attack and catches him off guard. The young man tries to turn around, but before he can react, the wolf is struck by Talia's dagger. Looking to the side, Nox sees Talia up in a tree, telling him to be careful, and he's thrilled by this. As she does this, the girl thinks that although Nox told her to run if things got dangerous, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Seeing Talia stepping to help, he feels impressed and even proud. After saving our protagonist, the girl asks Nox if he's alright. She also asks if he's injured anywhere. Seeing this, our protagonist can hardly believe that the girl truly helped him even after he underestimated her. But before he can think much about it, more wolves attack, but he manages to fend them off and cut them down. After finishing off those wolves, the boy is left somewhat out of breath. He then tells Talia that he's fine while thinking that now isn't the time to let his guard down. The redhead, on the other hand, is glad that Nox wasn't hurt. Looking ahead at his enemies, Nox thinks that he showed his pathetic side to the girl, and it's terrible. Looking at his hands and seeing them tremble, he realizes that his skills decline has already set in. And worst of all, this still isn't over. Then the alpha wolf leading the pack rises to join the fight. At least Nox feels relieved that the creature is finally stepping up. The wolf starts circling our protagonist while staring him down. The two opponents gaze at each other, recognizing each other's strength. The creature finally prepares and then rushes toward Nox. Surprised, the boy braces himself to defend against his opponent's attack. However, for some reason, the creature dashes past him without paying him any attention. Our protagonist is baffled by what that wretched beast is doing until he finally realizes. At that moment, the creature appears behind him, and before Nox can defend himself, he's struck by the wolf's claws. The creature manages to slash his arm, wounding him, and Talia, seeing this, screams in concern. The wolf then retreats back into the forest to blend in and hide among the bushes. Our protagonist is extremely irritated as he tries to stop the bleeding from his new wound. Frustrated, he questions whether that animal really was just 2.5 stars. He also mutters that the game developers need to revise that as this wolf is far too strong. Not knowing the wolf's exact location as it hides in the bushes, Nox realizes that this elite gray wolf is much more cunning and shrewd than in the game. The young man grips his sword, waiting for another attack from the creature, noting that it had caught him off guard. He reflects that he should have realized sooner when the wolf controlled the others, imagining that the monster could also take advantage of the terrain and its geographical benefits. At that moment, the creature emerges from a bush and charges toward Nox for another attack. This time, however, he's prepared to defend himself and says he needs to keep his guard up. He manages to react and counterattack, landing a solid blow on the wolf. The creature impacted by the attack is thrown back a few meters. However, Nox realizes that the monster isn't planning on retreating. Our protagonist immediately senses that the monster was already waiting for him to make a big move and leave an opening. At that moment, he begins to sweat, realizing he's let his guard down. His skills decline kicks in, and being cunning, the wolf seizes this opportunity, charging at him with its fangs bared. As he sees everything in slow motion, the boy acknowledges that he didn't foresee this outcome and wonders if he got overexcited because he'd beaten that game multiple times. Desperate for his life, he realizes it was foolish to think he could easily achieve everything he wanted in this world. Bracing himself for the worst, Nox closes his eyes, awaiting his fate. However, he hears the wolf's growl, as if it had been attacked. It's revealed that Talia's dagger has struck the creature squarely in the eye. Seeing this opportunity, Nox realizes that her weapon created an opening, allowing him to defeat the wolf now. He can't believe that the person who created that unexpected variable wasn't himself. Without hesitation, he tightens his grip on his sword and charges at the monster. With a precise strike to end the creature, he stabs the wolf in its belly. With both blows, the creature roars in pain, unable to respond. After that, the monster's body falls lifeless to the ground. Injured, Nox crouches, trembling from all the action. He just stares at the huge creature's body, breathing heavily. Talia immediately calls out to Nox, but then notices something. She sees that there are still other elite wolves nearby, but they immediately flee after seeing their leader defeated. Without hesitation, Talia climbs down to check on our protagonist and asks if he's alright, but the boy replies that he's fine. Nox prepares to thank the girl, but for some reason, hesitates. Talia, on the other hand, has tears streaming down her cheeks and Nox can't believe he almost thanked the enemy who will kill him in the future. He then tells her not to worry about him because he's alright. But with tears of frustration, she yells that Nox just got hurt and questions if he's really okay. As he stands and takes the torch from Talia's hand, he responds that it was just a scratch and that he's fine. Then, stopping her tears and smiling, the girl says she's glad Nox isn't hurt anywhere else. Suddenly, a spider descends from the tree and lands on Talia's shoulder. Noticing this, the girl is completely shocked, as if witnessing the most terrifying sight of her life. Nox, unaware, turns around in concern, wondering if another monster has appeared. The girl throws herself into our protagonist's arms, seeking rescue from him. The white-haired boy questions what's happening and why the girl acted so suddenly. While hugging Nox, Talia tries to explain that there was a spider on her shoulder. Looking at the creature, she becomes even more frightened. Desperate, Talia starts shaking Nox, who is completely confused, wondering how long the girl will cling to him. Our protagonist gives a small smile, realizing that Talia probably has a fear of spiders, which explains her reaction. He removes the insect from Talia's shoulder and then says that if a little spider scared her, he questions why on earth she followed him into the forest. The girl justifies it by saying that spiders are terrifying and asks if he doesn't feel the same. As a joke, the white-haired boy remarks that if she keeps acting like that, she won't be able to become a knight. Hearing this, the girl gets irritated and lets go of Nox, who celebrates being freed. However, due to his skills decline, he starts coughing. Concerned, Talia asks if he's alright and wonders what's going on. But coldly, Nox replies that she shouldn't worry about it. Looking at the girl, he feels genuinely proud, acknowledging that Talia really did her part and helped him. And smiling, he thinks to himself that he survived thanks to her, and couldn't say it before because she screamed suddenly. Although he silently thanks Talia, she, unable to hear it, just asks if he's really okay, clearly worried. As the sun begins to rise, Nox says that now there's only one thing left to do: leave the forest. We see something shadowy close to the elite wolf's body. Dawn is breaking, yet the two young people haven't left the forest. Emma, desperate and in tears, claims that it's her fault Miss Talia is dead. Rodwell, having lost hope, states that the two likely didn't make it and Talia's disappearance would create a problem between the two families. He mentions that because many children from the area disappear in the forest, some secretly claim the Reinhardt family is incompetent. At that moment, one of the other butlers asks Mr. Rodwell to look in a certain direction. They all see that the forest's mist is beginning to disperse. Emma is surprised by this, and Rodwell immediately realizes that the forest of lost children has been cleared. The maid, uncertain, asks if the rising mana means that, and Rodwell confirms she's correct. The butler comments that it signifies the forest has been cleared, meaning their one remaining hope has become reality. Emma immediately understands that this means young Master Nox has conquered the forest. Everyone then sees our protagonist emerging from the forest alongside his friend Talia. One of the butlers announces to everyone that the young master is finally coming out. They start murmuring, astonished that the young master actually cleared the forest and was walking out as if nothing had happened. Rodwell breaks into a smile, stating that he can't help but feel proud. At that moment, he's certain that the hierarchy among the Reinhardt family's descendants is about to be shaken up significantly. Confused, Nox asks why all the butlers and servants are gathered there, but Emma immediately calls out to her young lady. She embraces Talia and tells her she was worried, and Rodwell clarifies that the family was also concerned about the young master's disappearance. In his cold manner, the white-haired boy responds that he doubts they were worried about someone as useless as him, and his family's reputation was faltering. After a moment of relief and joy, Emma becomes frustrated and says she'll repeat all 71 family rules to her young lady once again. Knowing she was wrong, Talia tries to play innocent and apologizes to her maid. But visibly furious, the woman replies that she won't scold her, but the patriarch will personally teach her the rules. Watching Emma and recalling Rona, the boy comments that it seems this servant also has extraordinary stamina. At that moment, the maid thanks young Nox for protecting her lady. Talia also apologizes, explaining that she hadn't truly intended to accompany him into the forest. In a rare moment of kindness, Nox replies that she managed on her own and shouldn't blame herself too much. Hearing this, Talia feels extremely proud but remains silent for a moment. Sometime later, we see our protagonist dumping his things onto an armchair. While taking off his dirty clothes, he celebrates that finally, for now, it's all over. Even so, Nox is irritated, as he can't believe Rodwell was waiting outside the forest with the knights, which was completely unexpected. As he pulls something from his pocket, he mentions that despite everything, his mission was worth it. It was the hidden piece he so desired, a ring-like artifact called the Black Flame Ring. The system displays the ring's details, showing that its attribute is darkness, and it grants the wearer an additional point of stamina and mana. However, the narrator explains that the ring has an effect where, upon defeating someone, a small portion of the target's life energy is transferred to the artifact bearer. Examining the ring, Nox reflects that the only artifact capable of stealing someone's life force is this Black Flame Ring. Even so, just possessing the ring doesn't mean he'll live longer. Nox notes that a person's life can't be extended infinitely, and considering that only a small amount is absorbed, it won't exceed his time limit. But putting on the ring, he says that as long as he can fight and progress, it's much better than a hopeless life on the brink of death. Looking at his new artifact, the boy says he can feel his vitality and mana increasing. He then immediately calls Rona, stating that he knows she's outside, so she should come in. The girl gently opens the door and asks if, by any chance, our protagonist can see through walls. The boy replies that maybe he can, and the girl becomes extremely flustered upon hearing this and then asks if he can see her body too. Completely furious, Nox gives Rona a solid flick on the head and demands to know what she's talking about. She starts complaining, saying it hurts much more when her master is annoyed. For some reason, our protagonist challenges Rona to an arm wrestling match, and the girl asks if she really has to do that again. She asks if she wins this time, her salary will actually be raised, and Nox replies yes. However, if she loses, her salary will be reduced by 20%. The two clasp hands and prepare for the match. The countdown begins, and for some reason, Nox seems extremely confident. At the final count, in the blink of an eye, our protagonist slams her hand down on the table. Completely frustrated and with her plans ruined, the girl asks what just happened. Outraged, she says Nox knows it's unfit for a respectable family member to reduce his servant's meager salary by 20%. The boy agrees. However, he adds that, according to rumors, he's the worthless one in the Ran Harbor family. And with a sweet smile, he says that's why he's decided not to care about trivial things like honor. Desperate, Rona tries to apologize. Suddenly, something happens to Nox that leaves him completely dizzy and trembling. The system notifies that the effect of his constant ailment trait has been activated, and Nox has received a wrist fracture. He's extremely annoyed by his traits. As an act of kindness, he says he'll cancel Rona's salary reduction, but in return, he wants her to bring him some ice and a damp towel. Seeing that he's unwell, he remarks that for now, he'll be satisfied with just one ring and needs to rest a bit. Like a lost memory, we see Nox in the future affirming that he's certain of his true name, Yu-chan. A little later, we see Nox recapping that he obtained 2 hidden pieces 6 months ago, Kal and the Black Flame Ring. But unfortunately, he still hasn't had a chance to use them. In his room, a sign reads that he's grounded. Due to this punishment, the boy sighs in frustration. He says it's not as if he caused trouble, since he even cleared the forest of lost children, and he can't believe he was given a punishment instead of a reward. Extremely furious, he asks if Rona agrees with him. The girl replies that she does, but as a servant of the family, her salary would be docked if she spoke ill of the patriarch. Nox vents his anger on Rona, saying that if she doesn't act the way he wants, he'll cut her salary. The girl immediately starts saying that the patriarch was very strict, and he should understand how Nox felt, and at that moment, the young man just sits down in his armchair. He thinks that he has been trying hard to adapt and to have a productive life while observing Kal's progress. However, he couldn't go on like this as his life was ending. At that moment, the system notifies that the remaining life for Nox is 147 days. The boy gets irritated and mentions that the system cared more about his life than he did himself. Tired, he says he couldn't take it anymore and needed to go to his father to get permission to leave somehow. However, Rona says he shouldn't go as she had just heated the water for his bath, but at that moment, someone knocks on the door. We see that it was Rodwell, who was informing Nox that the patriarch was summoning him. The boy seems quite surprised by this sudden appearance. In a flashback, it's possible to see hundreds of bodies after what appears to be a war. Among that sea of bodies and death was Theo, wielding his sword. The man stood before several creatures that wanted him dead, while the narrator explains that it was the night of the massacre. The demonic creatures merely hovered over Theo to kill him. Together, they charge at Nox's father to end a man's life. However, he held his swords in his hands, and they were emitting a dark energy. Theo, with ease, managed to kill all those creatures in the blink of an eye with his sword imbued with dark energy. It is revealed that all of that was a memory of the young man sitting in his chair. He also thinks about the swarm of demons that was there, the humans who were taken by them, and that the night of the massacre was something dreadful and a disaster. The young man starts to wake up, and suddenly a dark mass of energy emerges from his body. Theo mentions that someday one of his children will probably receive the Tyrant's Blade of Darkness, and he couldn't trust probabilities. He needed a talent that was certain because one of them would have to kill him in the future, as that was the family tradition. At that moment, Rodwell arrives at the location, saying that the young master would arrive soon, but Theo was annoying that he was late. The man asks his butler to bring Nox while thinking that the Forest of Lost Children was a place even he didn't know how to clear. Theo also mentions that he couldn't imagine that his son had accomplished such a feat, and in fact, it would be logical to reward him. However, the reason for the delay was due to objections from the family vassals, who didn't believe Nox had changed and began an investigation to verify if he had indeed cleared the forest. The man states that even he couldn't ignore the opinions of his family's vassals, so the investigation was a necessary process. At that moment, Nox interrupts him, introducing himself and paying his respects to the family patriarch. The young man immediately asks the boy to stop bowing and stand up, and so he does. Ran Harbor says he is sure his son already knows that his actions were wrong, and the boy agrees. However, he says his job as patriarch is to give credit when it is due, even if to an unworthy person, and he summoned Nox to discuss his reward. Then, leaving Nox extremely surprised, the patriarch states he will grant the boy a request. He explains that he will fulfill just one wish of the young man, no matter what it is. Hearing this, our protagonist is incredulous, not believing he could have whatever he wanted. Our protagonist mentions that even he, who played inner lunatic all the time, was seeing Theo give a reward for the first time. The young man comments that this person was usually authoritarian and strict, and it felt like someone had just shot him in the head. Finally, he utters a word from his mouth and asks if he could really have anything. Theo, though thoughtful, says he will grant his son anything he asks for. The young man begins a speech saying that as the patriarch of the Rhine Harbor family, he promises to grant Nox anything and swears by the long history of his blade of darkness. In his mind, Nox notes that he didn't think this person was serious, but apparently he was. Nox's father finally says that if the boy's request is ridiculous, his evaluation of him will change, but he trusted the young man wouldn't do something foolish. Nox agrees and then immediately asks for some time to think about it. His father simply says that it's all right and that he'll allow the boy to leave the property from that day on. But he no longer has permission to get into trouble as before, and even with that caveat, Nox feels happy to be free and just thanks his father. However, before the boy leaves, his father says that Nox must always remember that he belongs to the Rhine Harbor family. The next day, we see a few people gathered and Talia is dressed in beautiful attire. The girl sadly says that the next time she'll see Nox will be at Eldon Academy. The young man acts with disdain and just looks at the girl, saying nothing. Still, she remains persistent and asks Nox if they could see each other one more time, yet the boy remains silent. Rodwell scolds our protagonist and insists that the boy should respond when a young lady asks him something, and the young man agrees. Kindly, Nox says that this will only happen if the girl becomes a full-fledged knight before then, motivating her. Seeing this, the girl becomes extremely excited, further fueling her desire to become a knight. The boy also mentions that the first step for that to happen is for Talia to not get so scared after seeing a giant spider. But upon hearing that, she becomes extremely shy and embarrassed. In response, the young woman punches Nox square in the gut, causing the boy to spit up a bit of blood. In his mind, the protagonist notes that his remarks should have been about wolves, not spiders, since the girl was ashamed of her fear. Still, before leaving, Talia says that, anyway, she'll return after becoming a full-fledged knight and Nox should prepare himself. Hearing this, the boy is shocked, wondering if that girl intended to kill him. At that moment, Emma thanks the boy's family for everything, especially Master Nox, but he questions why he's receiving such thanks. The maid says she's thanking him again for saving young Miss Talia. Sighing deeply, the boy with white hair simply responds that it's not as if he did it because he wanted to. Finally, he asks to be left alone and for the girls to leave, and they do so, boarding the carriage and departing. Our protagonist just watches the carriage as he thinks that someone has left in that moment. Yet still, he feels that he has slowly gotten used to this strange life. Nox also thinks he doesn't know the exact reason, but he's actually enjoying it, and once again, the system notifies him that he has 146 days left to live. Reading that, the boy comments to himself that he doesn't have time to rest and needs to take action. A few days later, we see Rona telling Nox that he needs to find a new maid or servant. Upon hearing that, the boy becomes thoughtful, saying that thinking about it, it's really a good idea. However, at that moment, Rodwell arrives, greeting his young master, and the boy asks what his servant wants. The butler explains that Eldon Academy had sent a trainee servant to assist the boy and that from that day on, she would be serving him. The young woman with green hair greets Nox and says that from now on, she'll be the exclusive maid of our protagonist, introducing herself. Our protagonist then, even while acting disdainfully, introduces himself back. Thinking about the name Jitri de la Villa, he remembers this girl and becomes thoughtful. Nox activates his system and begins analyzing all the girl's information to discover more about her. And upon a deep analysis, he realizes that the girl was actually there to monitor Nox based on orders from Theo Rhine Harbor. A bit before that situation and on the same day, once again, the system gives a notification about Nox's remaining lifespan, and this time, only 140 days remain. The young man thinks that when your time is limited, it seems to pass far too quickly. Even so, the only positive thing in this was that he was indeed evolving very quickly, despite having this severe penalty. Looking at the wind carrying flowers on his balcony, the young man notes that he too will soon be admitted to Eldon Academy. Rona arrives there and says that in 2 months, our protagonist will begin attending Eldon Academy and asks if he's feeling nervous. The boy asks if Rona is so happy because she'll get rid of him when he's at the academy, and the girl gets flustered. She begins to cry and says that, in fact, she's already even starting to miss Nox. Our protagonist says that he won't lower her salary, so she can stop exaggerating. He thinks that within the next few months, if his stats don't improve even a little, he clearly won't survive within the academy. The young man explains that Eldon is the best academy in the Empire and is where the most monstrous cadets from the entire country gather. After surviving that place and the main plot begins, he will have to take on the role of the villain Nox von Rhine Harbor. Thinking about this, the boy laments as everything has been so difficult for him. We then return to the moment when our protagonist was analyzing the information about that girl. Shamelessly, Jitri says that she will do her best to support Nox, and the boy thinks that he knew they wouldn't let him leave that place freely, hence why Jitri was there. The narrator begins to explain that Theo von Reinharber is one of the greatest villains and one of the strongest beings in that world. Many ask if he rose to his current position solely because of his swordsmanship. However, the main reason Theo was able to secure his place as the master of the family was because he always suspected everyone and everything around him and was extremely cautious. We then see the moment when the man tells the maiden that he has great expectations of her at that moment. The girl with green hair promptly responds that she will follow her master's orders. Theo says that he heard the girl had fallen behind in the family's line of succession, and if she performed her mission correctly, the Reinharber family would support her in that regard. The maid then says she will help young Master Nox with all her sincerity, but Theo asks her not to do so. The man begins to emit a crushing pressure that leaves the maid completely confused. She then promptly changes her words and says she will monitor the boy closely and report everything that happens to her lord. Jitri finally leaves that room while remembering her master's words. The young woman was somewhat breathless from the whole situation. She reveals a necklace with something in a pendant that was under her blouse. Looking at it, the young woman begins to say that from that point forward, she couldn't afford to slip up anymore. Then we see that the pendant actually contains a photo of Jitri's family. Sometime later, night finally falls and our protagonist is already lying in his bed. The boy is immersed in his thoughts, still thinking about the spy who was watching him. He comments that his father probably wanted to confirm whether he was truly Nox or not, since demonic possession was something that happened frequently in Inner Lunatic, and Nox was a character whose body was taken over by demon number 1 in the game. Finally, the boy states that as long as his father doesn't discover who he truly is, everything is fine. But actually, the only problem was Jitri. Our protagonist notes that as long as the girl isn't involved in the main story, it would be a waste to discard her. He explains that originally Jitri was meant to become the head of the Lavilia family, but her parents were killed by her uncle, and she lost her position as the next head. What happened after was obvious, and in the end, she became a servant for the Reinharber family, and she managed to escape from her family. Outwardly, it might seem that she was always smiling and cheerful, but inside, Jitri was already tired, hollow, and on the verge of breaking. So her final decision before the first part of the main plot of the story began was to take her own life, ending all her pain. Confused, our protagonist begins to wonder what he should do about that situation, since he didn't know if it was the right decision to change the story's plot and save a person who was meant to die. After all, if he did that, it would be like putting a noose around his own neck. The next day, we see Nox talking to his 2 maids. The boy says that from that day forward, he will hunt monsters within the territory's forest. And in addition, his 2 maids will go with him to assist him, but Rona seems uneasy about it. The girl begins to feel frightened as she didn't want to even think about the possibility of hunting monsters within the territory. On the other hand, Jitri promptly agrees without actually showing any reaction to that event. Rona then asks her friend not to simply agree with everything, but the girl seems somewhat embarrassed. Nox thinks it's normal for a maid to be afraid of hunting monsters, as after all, that request was absurd. But even so, Jitri responded very quickly and agreed to it, and we see that, in reality, the young woman was trembling with fear. Nox then tells Rona that he already knew she had used all her leaves to skip work. Therefore, he states that she wouldn't be allowed to take leave that day, and the girl becomes completely irritated. The little white-haired demon begins to exert pressure, saying that he was a useless person, and therefore, if Rona didn't obey him, he would cut her salary in half. Resigned to the situation, Rona asks if her master wanted her to bring a bow or a sword. Our protagonist, seeing that the girl promptly agreed, just gives a small smile. However, Jitri calls out to him. The young woman asks if she could inform Lord Rodwell that Nox would be leaving the property before beginning to prepare. The boy just nods, thinking that for now his priority will be to increase the remaining time of his life. Without hesitation, the 3 of them set off on horseback toward the edges of the forest to be in the hunt. Watching this scene through a window was Theo, who was keeping an eye on Nox's every move. A few days later, in the Forest of Lost Children, which now seemed normal after being cleared, our protagonist's group was gathered. We see a giant white-furred wolf rising to attack someone. Nox, without hesitation, charges at the creature to end it using his mastery of swordsmanship. With just 1 strike, he finishes off the monster and steals a small amount of the wolf's life force, slightly increasing his lifespan. We then see that Nox had already managed to gain 2 extra hours of life and was completely exhausted. After analyzing for a moment, he wonders if he had already killed all the wolves in that area. Our protagonist notes that since he gained 2 hours of life with that hunt alone, he could consider it almost a success. His maid, who was carrying water for her lord, says it had already been an hour since he started hunting and asks if Nox wasn't tired. The boy, on the other hand, seems irritated by something, which leaves the maid confused. Nox then thinks that his hunt took much longer than he had imagined, as he hadn't activated genius mode. In other words, he had only gained 1 hour, and he knew the calculations wouldn't be balanced. But it was unfair, and it wasn't like he could do it constantly. Upon closer analysis, Nox notes that his main concern was the limited number of monsters in that region. Moreover, he had already killed most of these creatures as he had been hunting for a few days, and at that rate, his plan for a good life would end up going down the drain. Nox tells the maid that not having as many monsters nearby anymore was also a huge problem. Jitri responds that she couldn't believe Nox considered that a problem, as if others heard what he was saying, they would call him crazy. Looking to the side, our protagonist notices the sun setting. He tells his maids that there's no other option and for now, they should return to the mansion. The girl asks if she should heat the water for Nox's bath, mentioning she'll set it to a pleasant temperature for her master. Nox remarks in his mind that such attentiveness was truly expected of a hygiene assistant, and then he says he'd like to bathe before dinner. The young woman with a smile on her face promptly responds that she'll take care of everything. Rona, irritated and jealous, asks not to be forgotten and says she'll clean Nox's room, but the boy just replies that she can do whatever she wants. The girl quickly gathers her hunting gear and prepares to leave, still envious of the treatment her friend was receiving. The boy then calls for his maid Jitri, who promptly responds, asking what he wants. Our protagonist merely says he has a question specifically for the girl, and coldly, he asks who Jitri serves. Hearing this, the young woman, for some reason, becomes extremely worried. Remembering Jitri's genius assistant trait, the boy says that no matter how beautiful and grand a sword is, it's useless if he can't wield it. In other words, if he couldn't use his maid, he wouldn't hesitate to discard her. At this moment, Jitri begins to stumble over her words. Seeing that the girl wasn't saying anything, Nox assumes that this was her answer. Nervous, the girl starts to sweat coldly, saying she hadn't answered yet. She begins to speak, but our protagonist interrupts her, saying he already understood what she meant. Then he comments that Jitri needn't worry, as he wouldn't question her anymore. And in fact, he even thanks her, as she hadn't lied at any moment. Nox then says that it doesn't matter whom Jitri serves, for he would treat her as one of his own. The girl, seeing her foundation crumbling, is left in shock, unable to respond to anything. The young man walks past his maid and says that if she ever needed it, she could also use him. And that was all he wanted to say. As he walks away, our protagonist thinks that, compared to having mutual trust, it would be enough if they simply used each other. After all, that's already the kind of relationship he has with the girl. A little later, night falls over the mansion. Rona is telling her colleague that her young master Nox is very cruel. As she eats some sweets, the girl mentions that this little demon always makes fun of her and is far too abusive. With a smile on her face, Jitri simply agrees with her friend, not wanting to interrupt. In her mind, the girl comments that she had already heard rumors that young master Nox had changed since she was still with the Lavilia family. And actually, she thought it was all made up, as it's rare for someone to change so drastically. But they said he defeated the twins with a single strike and earned the right to attend the academy. Furthermore, Nox also managed to solidify his position within the family, completely different from her, who, despite being a legitimate successor, had experienced a terrible downfall in her life. Looking at the photo of her parents, the girl begins to remember what Nox had said to her. Confused, she wonders what the boy meant when he said she could use him. A little later, an unfounded rumor began to spread within Rhine Harbor. This rumor claimed that Jitri had been expelled from her family, and that she no longer deserved to serve in the Rhine Harbor family. For some reason, the girl received a letter addressed to her. When she started reading, it was written that she, the incompetent successor who had sold out her family, would be held accountable for her sins. Additionally, Jitri would be deprived of all rights she held as a direct descendant. With despair in her eyes, the girl thinks that it also seems she couldn't stay in Rhine Harbor for much longer, and in fact, she had expected this. After all, among the Shadow families, Rhine Harbor is one of the greatest. But even if she was being used as a servant for a useless person, she was a commoner who had lost her family and didn't have the right to serve him. Walking through the halls, the girl thinks that she will soon be dismissed or else serve someone else. At that moment, she arrives at the place where all her friends were working and says hello to them. Seeing everyone's reaction, Jitri realizes that probably everyone has already heard about the rumors. And facing those expressions, she states that she was already accustomed to that disdainful look. However, suddenly, Rona approaches, calling for her friend and saying she looked for her everywhere. In her mind, Jitri wonders if her friend wasn't aware of the rumors yet. But at that moment, Rona takes the girl's hand. The green-haired girl starts to wonder if Rona was mocking her or if she truly considered her a friend. And either way, Rona was being quite foolish at that moment. Then we see that for some reason, the maid was pulling Jitri somewhere. Finally, the green-haired girl thinks that she, young Master Nox, and Rana were all being foolish at that moment. Sitting in his armchair, looking out his balcony, our protagonist thinks that the end was very near. He notes that besides Jitri, his father had probably also received the letter, and he knew the crimes her father was accused of were all completely fabricated. But he also knew that, unfortunately, he was unable to help the girl. Because if he helped Jitri survive, there was no way of knowing what kind of butterfly effect would result. On another day in the forest of lost children, we see a wolf being cut down. After wounding that creature, Nox calmly walks off in search of his next target. And while watching this, Rona asks Jitri if she doesn't think the young master seemed a bit aggressive that day. Hidden beside her friend behind a bush, the maid also mentions that her master used to be a bit more merciful in the past. But that day he seemed a bit strange, and hearing this, Jitri becomes puzzled by it. Watching the scene, the girl reports that Nox's behavior is making her feel uneasy. The boy continues his sword stained with blood in pursuit of more wolves to finish off. Confused, he says that it should already be time for that being to appear and wonders if that monster won't come out that day either. Our protagonist explains that in the Forest of Lost Children, there is a creature that appears randomly when only 20% of the monsters remain, the hidden boss. He had been thinking about killing this monster as he thought it might help him increase his stats. However, it didn't seem like it would work out. Suddenly, our protagonist begins to feel a crushing pressure. Out of nowhere, a shadow rushes past him, leaving him wondering what it was. A creature flies by his side, and seeing it, the boy realizes that its speed was on an entirely different level. Analyzing further, he concludes that a hidden boss was indeed worthy of such power. So the young man turns around. Happy, Nox celebrates, seeing that the elite Wasp King had really appeared and that it would pose a challenge. However, he notes that it's not as if this monster was on a level that he couldn't kill, and so a battle begins. Suddenly, someone calls out to the young master, and Jitri steps in front of the boy to protect him from the wasp's attack. Staying the scene and his maid being attacked, our protagonist thinks that even if Jitri hadn't helped him, it was an attack he could have blocked. However, he wonders why the girl tried to help him. Confused, he questions how many people would be capable of running toward a monster that appeared suddenly to save someone they cared about. Then, angered by seeing his servant being attacked, the young man declares that he too will have to use his abilities to save her. At that moment, he grips his sword tightly and immediately activates the Genius Mode skill. In a flashback, we see Jitri lying on the ground with her parents wondering why she always seemed to fall and cry. Lavilia remarks that it was what her parents always said to her, that her wounds never fully healed. However, this didn't apply only to the wounds on her knees but also to hearts, and she wondered if, from the beginning, they had already foreseen everything. With this, the girl recalls the moment Nox asked her whom she served. This leaves Jitri utterly confused, uncertain of the real answer to that question. In her thoughts, she remembers the moment her uncle killed her family and claimed that the family now belonged to him. The girl continues to wonder whom she should serve as all of our protagonist's words flash through her mind. At this moment, the boy was worried about his maid after defeating the monster. Desperate, he asks the young woman to hold on just a bit longer and assures her that everything would be fine. He states that it was all over now and that he would take her back to be treated. Looking at Nox's expression, the girl thinks that the young man was lying and that, in truth, he never intended to use her. Nearly blacking out from her injuries, she begins to question. Why was his voice so shaky and angry? Then at that moment, she closes her eyes. In the Patriarch's office, reading a letter, Theo confirms that it was indeed a problem. Rodwell says that based on his investigation, the contents of the letter were genuinely true, and that the Lavilia family had decided to disown Miss Jitri for good. Theo remarks to himself that the reason he brought Jitri there to begin with was to take over her family, given that they had lost their previous leaders and were unstable. He imagined this would be the perfect opportunity to seize control, as the internal situation within the family was so unbalanced that the successor's position was uncertain. So if the Reinhardters got involved in some way, they could subdue that family. However, Theo wonders what will happen now that Jitri was expelled from the family before he could execute any plan. Finally, he tells his butler that he has no choice and questions what they should do about the girl. Rodwell asserts that, although it's unfortunate, if they keep a maid who doesn't belong to a family by young Master Nox's side, they would be looked down upon by Elden Academy, and the solution would be to handle this discreetly, to which Theo readily agrees. Suddenly, someone bursts into the room, calling for his lord, and Rodwell questions why the man entered without permission. He apologizes but reports that young Master Nox had arrived carrying a maid who was injured during his hunt. The man explains that the girl was poisoned and was in critical condition, and that Nox used an extremely expensive antidote without permission, which is why he was there to report it. The butler, surprised, asks his subordinate if Nox truly used the purifying mandrake potion, and the man regretfully confirms. Rodwell remarks that it was extremely costly, and Theo wonders aloud if Nox had become so attached to that maid so quickly. In his mind, Nox's father remarks that no one knows what result could come from a personal feeling like that. At that moment, in the mansion, Rona is frantically shouting, asking if Jitri is awake. Seeing her friend open her eyes, she starts crying and shedding tears. The green-haired girl is very confused, wondering what is happening and if Master Nox is safe. She remembers the moment she sacrificed herself to protect him and wonders why she did that at the time. Rona then explains to her colleague that the young master had given her a very expensive antidote, though she forgets the name of the potion. The maid explains that our protagonist threatened the doctor even though he didn't want to give the potion to Jitri, and that Nox had completely ignored everything else. In fact, she thinks the kind side of Nox still exists, and hearing this, Jitri wonders why Nox did that. Jitri tries to sit up, but Rona urges her to rest more as her wounds are still critical. But undeterred, the maid asks where Nox is. Rona informs her that he went to find the housekeeper, and that she should let him know when Jitri woke up. Then she leaves the room asking Jitri to stay lying down, promising to return soon. Ignoring the orders, Jitri stands up and goes to one of her bags. She starts packing her things to leave, affirming that she shouldn't be there. The truth was, she felt she didn't belong anywhere and didn't deserve anything. Feeling completely isolated, she opens the locket on her necklace to look at the photograph of her parents and then removes the picture. The girl leaves the locket beside a letter, informing her young master that the necklace was there to cover the cost of the potion used on her. Before setting off on her new journey, Jitri thanks her master for saving her life. However, while walking through the corridors to leave, someone appears. A commanding voice questions where the girl thinks she's going. Our protagonist, standing in front of his maid, stares at her imposingly. Once again, with a serious expression, he asks where she thinks she's going. A little earlier, we see Nox questioning the doctor about whether, even with someone dying, his only concern was the potion's value. Embarrassed, the doctor replies that wasn't the issue. Instead, it was because Nox didn't have permission from the patriarch to use it, so he also couldn't administer the potion. Moreover, there were other reasons behind it, but they weren't relevant. Our protagonist asked the doctor if his position in the family was higher than that of Theo's son. The man immediately apologizes and bows, responding that it wasn't. Nox then orders the man to use the potion, saying he would report it to his father personally, and he didn't need to worry about anything. After administering the potion, Rona asks if Jitri will be alright, and the doctor replies that now that the poison has been neutralized, the girl should be fine. Crying, the girl is relieved her friend will be okay, and then asks what her young master intends to do. Before leaving the room, Nox asks Rona to notify him as soon as Jitri wakes up. Elsewhere, Theo asks his son what he wants, noting that it's quite rare for him to seek him out. Finally, the man asks if his son is there because of that maid. Before speaking, our protagonist activates his master of acting skill. Nox says he remembers that his father promised to grant him anything he wanted, and the man readily agrees. Then the young man states that he wants Jitri de Lavilia, even if she has been disinherited by the family. Theo feels somewhat apprehensive about the unexpected request. Our protagonist says to himself that whether it's a butterfly effect that influences the main plot or Theo's spy, such things no longer matter to him. And that day, when he saw Jitri try to save him, he realized something. The answer she hadn't given him before about whom she served. Through her actions, Jitri had now responded, practically affirming that she served Nox. His father concedes, saying he understands and that if that's what his son wants, he shall have it. The boy stops bowing and stands up to have a conversation with his father. He tells the patriarch that his useless son has just one more thing to say. The man, already fed up, asks Nox to just say what he wants. Nox begins to grow irritated, and the system notifies him that the effectiveness of the master of acting skill is declining due to his state, and the boy says that even if Theo is his father, he asks the man to please stop playing games with his people, his expression chilling. Then he departs without another word, leaving the man standing silently watching his son's departure. We return to the present moment with Nox facing Jitri, questioning where she thought she was going. Trembling, the girl responds that she's leaving, saying she doesn't think she has a place there anymore. She thanks Nox for everything he's done for her, but at that moment, the young man declares he'll ask one last time. The boy questions where Jitri was going instead of helping him as his maid. Utterly desolate, the girl simply replies that her master should already know the answer. The girl explains that she received orders from the patriarch to watch over Nox, which also included deceiving him. And yet, she wants to know why Nox is trying to stop her from leaving. She begins to lash out, saying she deceived him. The maid even asserts that she has no right to complain about anything, even if Nox expelled her right now. So she wants to know why the boy is acting that way. Hearing this, our protagonist starts to wonder if this is the real Jitri, as that side of her seems so much more alive. The side where she would choose not to give up and keep pushing forward even when times get dark and difficult. Nox tells his maid that for starters, people make mistakes. However, the girl denies it and says she committed a grave offense against her master, to which Nox responds that that's exactly why. He notes that after making such an affront, she couldn't just leave without compensating him, and he asks who said she could go. Upon hearing that declaration, Jitri is in complete shock. Finally, Nox commands Jitri to stay there, saying he doesn't know what his father thinks, but he doesn't need the Lavilia family's name. In truth, he only needs his maid's talents. As he walks past her, the young man states that he wants her there and wants her to stay by his side, helping him until she can make up for everything. Hearing this, the girl is overwhelmed with joy, as since her parents' death, she has never heard such beautiful words. She starts to cry and then tells her master that she understands everything he said. With tears in her eyes, she says she will stay by the young man's side to the end and help him. With a smile on his face, Nox simply replies that that's great. Once again, Jitri says that her master had once asked her whom she served, and Nox replies that yes, he did. Finally, the girl asks if our protagonist already knew whom she served. Excited, the boy responds, saying he knew very well whom Jitri served. Some time passes, and we see Rona telling one of her friends that the young master had threatened the doctor, saying he would kill him. At that moment, the young man arrives and asks his maid to avoid insulting him right in front of him, and the girl is startled to see her master had heard everything. Our protagonist, noticing the girl didn't even try to hide it, complains because she didn't bother to make excuses and denies she was insulting him. Rona, realizing her friend is there, asks if she's feeling better, noting that she shouldn't exert herself in offering to help her. With that, Rona takes the clothes Jitri was carrying and tells her young master she'll dry them. The boy immediately puts his hand on his head, questioning why his maid is always causing so much trouble. He then asks if Jitri already knows that she'll be attending the academy with him, and the girl replies that she does and has already nearly completed her preparations. She explains that she prepared by packing basic things her master might need, such as books, medicines, emergency items, clothes, and the cadet uniform. The girl continues talking, but Nox can only watch her with a smile, realizing how diligent she truly is. Nox also notices that Jitri no longer forces herself to smile around him, making it much more comfortable to converse with her like this. Now they don't need to exchange unnecessary compliments or engage in meaningless small talk. However, if they find themselves backed into a corner someday, then when they're back to back, they'll betray each other. Even so, for his relationship with her, this was already good enough and indeed an accomplishment. On another day, we see someone asking her young master if he's really okay. This person is Jitri, who goes on to say that recently some negative rumors about him have been spreading. Hearing this, the boy feels confused, thinking it's impressive that there could be worse rumors than before. Embarrassed, the green-haired girl comments that the rumors say the reason Nox kept her as his maid was because he was in love. Upon hearing that, the young man starts trembling, unable to believe he could feel so embarrassed, even while playing the role of Nox. Right afterward, he apologizes to Jitri, saying that she's being teased because of him. However, the girl says that's not why she mentioned it. She explains that she only thought Nox might feel uncomfortable because of these rumors, so she wanted to inform him so he'd be aware of the situation. The young man tells his maid not to worry since she must have already heard the old rumors of him being the useless, idiotic, incompetent youngest of the family. The girl tries to calm the situation, but Nox says he'll fire her if she keeps lying, so Jitri admits she really has heard those rumors. And the worst part is that there are also rumors saying Nox is a pervert, and she asks if that's true. Composing himself, the young man thinks his current image is much better now. Before, he was a reckless, useless weakling. But now he's just a somewhat capable brat who does as he pleases. He notes to himself that he still needs to find a balance. After all, Nox is the villain and he must continue playing this role so the protagonist can shine. Because he isn't the main character of inner lunatic and can't pretend to be. At this moment, he asks his maid to forget about it and to stop talking about these rumors immediately. Suddenly, he tells the girl that he has a task for her. He explains that, as Jitri should already know, for them to survive Elden Academy, it's not just her that needs to be prepared. He does too. The young woman asks what kind of preparations her master is talking about. Nox thinks that Jitri's stubborn trait shows how trustworthy and determined she is, and it wouldn't hurt to reveal a bit of his plans. In fact, it even makes it easier to instruct her on tasks, so he reveals that he plans to study magic before entering the academy and wants Jitri's help. The girl is completely shocked, asking if her master doesn't know that it's illegal in the Empire and whether he still intends to do it. Confident, Nox simply replies that he does, as the family's useless pervert who doesn't care about anything, and Jitri just says he's being quite shameless. And besides, our protagonist was quite resentful, but despite everything, the girl agrees. She comments that she's certain Nox made that decision for a reason and would find some basic books to help him in any way she could. Our protagonist gives a small smile, realizing the young woman is truly competent, just as expected. Suddenly, we hear someone shouting, and at that moment, Nox wonders what all the commotion is about. He goes to his window to find out where all the noise and excitement are coming from. At that moment, we see Rodwell announcing that the new Master Grain is arriving, and our protagonist realizes that finally, his brother has returned after graduating. And for some unknown reason, he even forgotten about this extremely important event. Confident and pleased, the boy remarks that his chance to extend his life has finally arrived. Nox calls his maid and says that from that point on, he'll need to go on a mission far away. The girl with a sigh only asks what he's going to come up with this time. Then we see the young man humming to himself as he watches his brother's arrival. A bit later, we see a banquet served at the table. Theo praises his son for graduating from Elden Academy. The young Grain von Reinharber simply thanks his father elegantly. Our protagonist begins to recap his brother's history, noting that he's Theo's second son and one of Nox's older brothers. Looking over Grain's information, the boy also notes that he's a flashy guy who likes materialistic women. And on top of that, he's quite an opportunist. At that moment, we see Grain sharing more about his time at the academy. The boy also explains that the only reason Grain's true personality hasn't been exposed is because Nox is seen as an even worse failure. Moreover, his brother is excellent at getting along in the political world. Grain also used those talents in political maneuvering to make graduation easier, as Elden Academy is famous but very challenging to graduate from. Nox notes that fewer than 1,000 people pass the admission test, and only half of those make it to graduation. At that moment, Theo asks his son if his departure date for Chaders has already been decided. Grain replies that it has, as he'll head to southern Chaders in 3 days. The patriarch then remarks that if he's going there at this time of year, it must be a monster hunting mission, to which the boy agrees. The narrator explains that Chaders lies just beyond the Rhine-Harbor Range. It's a neutral southern territory bordering the undeveloped desert. There, besides being barren, it's also infested with monsters and is the worst kind of wasteland. Grain's mission is to stop a wave of monsters, as the Arkham Empire has a rule that one must complete their first assigned mission to become a knight. Grain explains to his father that when winter arrives, Chaders always fills with monsters, and it seems the Imperial family wants to take some preliminary measures. Theo responds that despite being an outer land, the other districts will suffer too if it falls. So he asks Grain, under any circumstances, not to tarnish the Rhine Harbor name. The boy simply bows and replies that he will remember that. Nox, listening to this, thinks that the Chaders' mission isn't just a simple monster hunt. The one end is just a side story. There are several other, even more complex plot lines involved. Therefore, he needs to profit greatly from it. Our protagonist finally speaks up at that dinner and asks if his brother is really going to Chaders, to which the young man replies yes. Thinking that logically, to gain that profit, he'll have to join the subjugation in Chaders himself, he asks Grain if he could go along. His brother and father are completely surprised by that request from the family's useless member. His brother asks Nox what he's talking about and if he even knows what kind of place that is. Surprisingly, Nox replies that he's heard it's a neutral territory where monsters attack suddenly, in an unpredictable way, and that bandits dominate. Hearing this, Grain responds that he's recently heard a lot about Nox, and at that moment, our protagonist recalls that Grain's ability is called precise detection. So Grain asks if it's true that Nox really cleared the forest of lost children with the second daughter of the Stillreiner family. The boy replies affirmatively, while in his mind he notes that Grain's skill detects lies if the target's status is lower than his. In summary, that's the skill that made him an expert in political games in their world. And at that moment, Grain begins reassessing everything Nox has done. Our protagonist simply replies yes, while thinking that his steel mentality skill counteracts precise detection. Nox's brother, irritated, just says that he's achieved many good things lately, but he can't allow him, someone who hasn't even been admitted to Eldian Academy, to accompany him on this mission, as he doesn't want to be the one retrieving Nox's corpse afterward. For some reason, Theo stands up and asks his son to wait, then says he thinks he can personally ensure that won't happen. At that moment, in an unexpected move, the man orders his son to take Nox with him. Grain tries to protest, but Theo simply states that it's an order. Nox remains silent, stunned by his father's action, and finally, Theo mentions that their family will provide the necessary supplies for the mission. Moreover, Nox should make the necessary preparations to depart in 3 days. The boy, confused by the entire situation, questions what just happened and if his father really granted him permission that easily. Reflecting on it, he wonders if his father is planning something with that decision. Nox's brother, completely furious with what's happening, demands to know what Nox is plotting. Grain also asks if Nox has truly lost his mind, exuding an intimidating aura. The young man responds that no matter how crazy it is, he can't be any crazier than he already is, and Grain questions if his brother really dares to joke. The older brother grabs Nox by the collar, warning him to be careful, since it would be a shame if he got hurt after gaining that rare chance to go to Chaders. At that moment, someone accidentally spills a glass of wine. We see that the one who slipped and caused this was Jitri, who is utterly shocked. In reality, the wine spilled over Nox, and Jitri, embarrassed, apologizes, saying she'll wash it for him immediately. Grain releases Nox, treating him with disdain. Nox tells his brother it seems his maid made a mistake and then apologizes on her behalf. After that, he excuses himself and begins to leave with Jitri toward his room. Before exiting through the door, the boy says he'll see his brother in 3 days when they head to the subjugation in Chaders. Hearing his brother's insinuation, Grain just watches Nox leave, seething with anger. A short while later, we see our protagonist thanking Jitri after changing clothes. He remarks that thanks to her, he managed to get out of a problem, and the girl responds that her master certainly has a knack for getting into trouble. Confused, she asks if everything will really be okay since Chaders is such a strange place, and Nox merely responds that it'll be fine. Suddenly, Rona's voice rings out, echoing through the room as she calls for her master. She asks where their young master just said he was going. Hearing this, our protagonist questions if his maid forgot that he is the young master here. Nox simply replies that everything has already been decided, thinking to himself that the news of a useless person joining a subjugation in Chaders is indeed shocking. Jitri, concerned, also speaks up and says she's siding with Rona this time and won't stay silent. She asserts that she thinks the Chaders region is very dangerous, with hundreds of monster and bandit attacks. Nox thinks that's exactly why he's going, as it's his chance to increase his lifespan. So he responds that both of them should stay calm, as he knows exactly what he's doing. The boy adds that for this mission, he'll be going alone, so they should stay behind, but Jitri just says she's sorry. Then she comments that she can't let Nox do this alone. She explains that as his personal maid, she has a duty to assist him wherever he goes, so she'll be accompanying him. However, Nox responds that she might get hurt, but Jitri is already aware of that. And more defiant than ever, she retorts that the same applies to Nox. Additionally, she'd heard from Rona that her master was quite weak and tended to get sick easily, so she'd have to accompany him. Not only that, Nox wouldn't be able to handle such a long trip without a maid, as he often ends up forgetting his belongings. He'd also need his clothes washed, and after that massacre, Jitri asks if Nox truly thinks he can do all that alone, without any help. Our protagonist nods, thinking it makes sense, as she mentions some trivial details he wouldn't need to worry about otherwise. But if he died, Jitri would also have issues with her position within the Ran Harbor family, so she had no choice but to follow him. Finally, he agrees but states that Jitri will have to obey him and will also need to learn how to ride Cal. Only then could she come along. The girl agrees and mentions that she's actually close to Cal, but upon hearing this, Rona questions if Jitri has really gotten close to him. Confused, Rona asks how Jitri managed that, and the girl explains that she spent half her salary on high-quality sugar cubes and gave them to him. Hearing this, Rona questions if the horse didn't find hay delicious as well. Finally, she remarks that Cal is just as arrogant as his master, but upon hearing that, Nox says Rona will be staying behind. After giving Rona a light tap on the head, he turns to Jitri, telling her she'll be helping him, and since she's coming along, she needs to prepare a few things. Before leaving, Nox notices that Rona has been very concerned and wonders if she'll really be alright. Suddenly, there's a knock on the door, and the three of them in the room look at each other in confusion. Rodwell opens the door and tells young Master Nox that the Patriarch wishes to give him an item. Hearing this, our protagonist is completely baffled by this unexpected gesture from his father. He then recalls Theo's statement that the family would provide the necessary supplies for the mission and wonders if this is one of the items he mentioned. Moreover, during dinner, Theo seemed to be on his side for some reason, and his father is probably plotting something. Finally, we see the Patriarch welcoming his son into his office. As the boy bows before his father, he remarks that he heard he had something to give him. The man responds that he does, but whether our protagonist can obtain the item depends on him. He opens a box containing a gigantic sword and explains that it's the sword of the first Patriarch of Ran Harbor. Seeing that object before him, our protagonist remains speechless for a brief moment, wondering if that's really the first Patriarch's sword. Looking at his father, the young man comments that this is, at the very least, quite unexpected since this item never appeared in Inner Lunatic. Even as a veteran player who's completed the game 27 times, he didn't know it existed. Confused, the young man wonders why his father would give him such a thing, as he doesn't understand the situation at all. Determined to obtain it, he decides he must get that weapon no matter what, but upon closer inspection, he notes that the sword's appearance is unusual. Theo then tells his son that the sword probably looks worn out to him. However, it accompanied the first Patriarch throughout his life and has been with him all this time. Excited, our protagonist asks his father what test he must pass to obtain the weapon. The man simply replies that he should try to hold it. The young man hesitates for a moment but reaches for the hilt of the gigantic sword. As he grips it, a powerful dark aura begins to emanate from it and a wave of darkness fills the room. Nox realizes that his mana is being entirely absorbed by the object. The color of the blade begins to shift and Nox instantly notices this as he watches the weapon emit that purple aura. Theo stands up and says that, as expected, his son has started to sense mana. The boy remains confused, but his father walks past him, remarking that it's just as he thought and it's fantastic. He explains that the sword absorbs its master's mana and releases it multiple times over. Hearing this, Nox, confused, responds that he thinks it won't be an easy sword to wield. However, suddenly he realizes that the dark mana emanating from the weapon is intensifying. The system notifies him that his mana is being absorbed too quickly. Due to the abrupt change in his condition, the Master of Acting trait begins to destabilize. Nox immediately realizes it would be dangerous if his mana were drained this quickly. At that moment, Theo seizes the opportunity, telling Nox that if he wants to receive the sword, he only needs to pass a small test and hold it for 10 minutes. Hearing this, the young man is shocked. Nox understands that, in his current state, it would be impossible to endure that long, mentally cursing his father as a wretched man. Finally, Theo reveals the sword's name, Stormbringer. While Nox struggles to endure, the system begins displaying information about the sword. One detail is that its special effect is that whenever Nox kills something with it, the sword will absorb his mana and convert it into its own stats. And after accumulating a significant amount of the player's mana, the sword will unleash it, unlocking its power. However, Nox isn't concerned with that at the moment. Instead, he's focused on the system message indicating that his mana has been entirely consumed and that it will switch his energy source. The system informs him that his life force is now being converted into mana, and the sword begins to absorb it. The boy's life starts to drain rapidly, leaving him in a state of complete panic. Holding the weapon, he realizes he can't handle it anymore and needs to give up immediately, or something bad might happen. However, for some reason, he's unable to release the sword at all. He realizes that the cursed sword is exploiting him, while Theo watches the scene. The Patriarch, observing Stormbringer, states that the weapon is a magical sword that grants great power to its wielder, but also harms them. The first Patriarch used it to build a family, yet while Ran Harbor became respected, his descendants were unable to wield the weapon. Theo reflects that most people would have fainted from exhaustion the moment they gripped that sword, and lasting more than 10 minutes is incredible. Furthermore, he admits that even with his training, he can barely hold it for an hour. Still, he ordered his youngest son, who hasn't even learned how to control mana, to hold that sword. The man notes that, including the recent incident where Nox saved his maid, His son has always been involved in major events, so none of this could be a coincidence. In other words, his son is truly evolving, far beyond his expectations. Theo even thinks that perhaps the boy has as much talent as the Sword Emperor, and in fact that's why he decided to test Nox. If he can endure wielding it for 10 minutes, it means he could become the greatest patriarch in the history of their family. At that moment, our protagonist places the sword's tip on the ground and begins to rise. Finally, Theo reflects that Nox will probably surpass him, and eventually, he'll be able to kill him, which is exactly what he desires from his son. Watching Nox, the man remarks that, as he thought, the boy was indeed hiding his strength. The young man questions what his father is talking about, but seriously, Theo merely walks past him. Imposingly, he declares that from now on, the sword's Stormbringer belongs to Nox. The boy, sweating after all he's endured, simply thinks that this is a nightmare. He comments that he should at least get his life force back before his father just leaves. 3 days later, we see the cavalry prepared for the Chader's subjugation journey. Jutri, riding on the same horse as Nox, mentions that she had a lot to bring, and luckily, the dimensional bag could hold it all. Nox, however, maintains a serious expression. Seeing this, the young woman thinks Nox is very anxious for the mission, but suddenly, he seems to be in a foul mood for some reason. Our protagonist is only thinking that despite Theo giving him another item besides Stormbringer, he's not even remotely grateful after seeing all of his hard-earned life force disappear. Observing his brother, the boy comments that Grain really brought a lot of stuff. Moreover, even though he allowed Nox to come along on the condition that he carry all of it, it's still a bit much, though since he'll make use of Grain, it's fine. Suddenly, an argument breaks out about which direction leads to Chader's. For some reason, the guides are debating which way to go. Grain, completely furious, thinks they'll be delayed significantly if this continues. Angry, the boy immediately approaches his subordinate Ron, asserting that he guaranteed they would find the way. Embarrassed, the captain of the Order of Knights hired by Grain apologizes, explaining that this happened because he'd never taken that route before. Watching this, our protagonist calls those men idiots, and upon hearing that, Jutri asks what her young master is talking about. The boy simply replies that he wasn't speaking to his maid, he was talking about those incompetent fools. For some reason, he makes his horse approach Grain's and calls out to his brother. He asks Grain if they're having some kind of problem. In his usual snobbish way, Grain merely responds that it's none of our protagonist's business. But immediately, Nox realizes and remarks that Grain really is lost. Furious, Grain turns around, saying he just told him it's none of his business. However, with a confident expression, Nox offers to lead them all to Chader's. Staring at Nox, Grain thinks that this boy has lived in the mansion his entire life, so there's no way he could lead them to Chader's. But for some reason, Nox, confident, asks Grain to let him guide the expedition, noting that he's skilled enough that even the family vassals praise him. Hearing this, Grain appears thoughtful, while Jutri thinks the lie is absurd, even for her master. Grain considers that it could be an issue if they arrive too late, but wonders what would happen if Nox fails to lead them there. If that happens, he'd likely be able to crush his brother's confidence, so maybe taking a small detour isn't a bad idea. Finally, Grain tells Nox that since he's so confident, he'll let him leave for now, and the boy smiles at his brother. Our protagonist then takes the lead on his horse, Cal, and starts heading in a direction. Sometime later, we see a campfire and a camp set up by Grain's vassals. Outraged, Grain questions his vassals, asking how Nox managed to find the correct path so quickly. He states that the South hasn't even been fully explored yet, and even trained guides struggle to find the way there. None of this makes any sense. Irritated, he continues, unable to believe that his brother actually did it, even though he's never left the mansion. Nox, behind a tent, listens to all the complaints. He thinks to himself that he knows this route better than anyone. For a veteran player, this is a piece of cake. Nox even remarks that he's visited Chader's hundreds of times and that the area is a strategic point. At that moment, Jutri arrives, calling for her young master and asking how he found the way so quickly. The boy points in a direction and asks if she sees what's on the ground. He explains that those are the footprints and feathers of an owl bear. This is a monster that lives in the south with the body of a bear and the head of an owl, and its habitat is on the southern border of Chader's. In other words, if he follows the direction of these tracks, it's easy to find the route to Chader's. Concerned, Jutri asks if it's safe to camp in an owlbear's habitat that night. Nox replies that those creatures fear fire and won't come to the camp with this many people around. All of Grain's vassals praise our protagonist, impressed by his skill. Hearing this and even being compared to his younger brother, Grain becomes completely furious. He turns to his subordinates, Schultz, and questions if Hartz and Allen really lost to Nox. Grain's butler promptly responds that yes, that's what happened. Determined, Grain says he needs to see how strong Nox is. His butler then responds that fortunately, he has the perfect item for that. He pulls a small leather pouch with an item inside from his clothes. Seeing this, Grain laughs wickedly, saying it looks like Nox will have a very long night. At that moment, we see Jutri and Nox coordinating the vassals to set up the camp. Finally, after everything is in order, night falls over the camp. The guard on duty is asleep, and a horrendously ugly, ogre-like creature begins to approach the camp from the forest. From one of the tents, Nox awakens and realizes it has already begun. With his sword in hand, he stands up and Jutri asks what's happening. The boy steps out of his tent and tells his maid to wait there because he has some matters to handle. Under the moonlight in the forest, our protagonist stands before a few creatures. We see that these monsters are ogres armed with spiked clubs. Despite this, Nox seems to be handling the situation well and isn't taking it too seriously. Looking at the item Schultz threw near his tent, he identifies it as the cause. The boy explains that it's mixed with female ogre pheromones and grain known its mating season, used it to attract the monsters. He remarks that even if his brother intends to intimidate him, he won't back down. Drawing his sword, our protagonist commands his Stormbringer to take his life force, and the system notifies him that the weapon is responding to his mana and will. One of the ogres, enraged, charges our protagonist to kill him. Thanks to his agility, Nox dodges the first attack. He then leaps, evading another blow from the 3 ogres attacking him. In midair, he turns his sword's blade downward, aiming to land it on a monster. He advances toward one of the creatures, successfully piercing it through the back. After that, the 2 remaining monsters seize the moment and move to attack the small boy. However, with extreme agility, he manages to strike both creatures. One of the monsters begins to gush ketchup from his wound and collapses to the ground. Seeing this, Nox realizes that his sword is indeed powerful. He comments that he was worried about potential issues if it began to consume his mana recklessly, but it seems he worried for nothing. Once again, he turns to one of the creatures, now staggering from the initial sword strike, and hits it again. In his mind, the boy notes that it feels as though his sword is moving exactly in the direction he wants. After finishing off 3 of the ogres, he notices only 1 creature remains. The last monster drops its weapon and becomes extremely intimidated by Nox's presence. It turns to run, and our protagonist thinks he can't let it escape. The young man whistles and calls for his horse, Cal. Cal, who is asleep, promptly awakens, and suddenly, his mane begins to glow. At that moment, Cal passes by our protagonist, who mounts his steed. The 2 of them quickly chase down the ogre, determined not to let it get away. Without mercy, Nox ends the life of the unfortunate creature while riding his horse. After the last ogre is defeated, the system notifies Nox that he has gained 1 day and 9 hours of life from defeating the ogres. At that moment, Jitri emerges from the tent, concerned about her young master's well-being. As he dismounts from Cal, the young man reminds her that he told her to wait in the tent, and Jitri, confused, asks how those ogres appeared at the edge of the forest. Nox, on the other hand, ignores her question and states that someone lured the ogres there on purpose. She's baffled, but our protagonist declares that it was Grain von Ranharber. The boy explains that his brother used the ogre's behavior to make them attack, which is why he set up his tent far away. The maid realizes this means that young Master Grain was trying to keep Nox under control, and our protagonist confirms she's correct. Apparently, Grain thinks he doesn't deserve to be in the family's line of succession, and that's why he figured it'd be better to test his abilities here. Nox explains that compared to Garen, the eldest son, Grain isn't very strong, so he had no choice but to resort to a cowardly plan. Annoyed, Nox declares he'll show his brother that such a scheme won't work on him. He takes a vial from his bag, and Jitri asks what he's planning to do. With a wicked smile and an intimidating expression, Nox asks if she knows how to attract even more ogres. For some reason, our protagonist begins collecting the ketchup dripping from the bodies of the creatures. He reveals that to attract more ogres, he'll use their own blood, as ogres are like humans. They seek to avenge their fallen companions, and he'll use that desire to exact his own revenge. Meanwhile, for some reason, a crystal orb is emitting a sound and energy. Grain, upon waking, questions what's happening with the mana detection crystal and why it's reacting that way. He explains that it's a magical tool that senses nearby monsters' mana, wondering if it's malfunctioning. He's confused as they're still at the forest's edge, and a strong enough monster shouldn't be around to trigger the crystal. Suddenly, a loud noise is heard outside his tent, and his subordinates begin shouting for their young master. Schultz enters the tent, urging his lord to flee immediately. Grain, bewildered, demands to know what all the commotion is about. As he steps out, he sees multiple ogres attacking his subordinates, and Schultz explains that the ogres appeared suddenly in large numbers. Nox's brother is in complete shock, asserting that those creatures shouldn't be there. By morning, a pile of ogre bodies lies among the camp's ruins. Enraged, Grain is berating his subordinate, calling him a fool. Frustrated from a sleepless night, he asks if Schultz placed the pheromone item on his tent. However, Schultz quickly replies that he clearly put it on young Master Nox's tent. Meanwhile, our protagonist is just waking up after a long night's sleep. The young man remarks that it's a beautiful morning and asks if his mate agrees, but Jitri merely suggests he should have breakfast. He sits by the fire and invites Jitri to join him, but she insists that, as his servant, she can't eat alongside her master. Nox responds that they're on a mission, and it'd be inconvenient if she had to prepare food separately. He also jokes that it'd be bad if a monster appeared. Trying to spoof Jitri, he mentions that dozens of ogres might show up just like near his brother's tent. Jitri rubs her head, and Nox asks what's wrong. She replies that her master is quite shameless. Nox merely laughs, telling her she'll soon get used to it. Meanwhile, Grain is ordering his subordinate to take down all the tents as they're preparing to move out. Looking at one of the blood-stained tents, Nox thinks it needs to be discarded, otherwise it'll continue attracting ogres. His maid asks what he plans to do next and if they should assist Grain. However, Nox firmly declines, saying he has no reason to help since his brother is an outright jerk. Jitri is confused, pointing out that if they don't help, the creatures will keep being attracted. Our protagonist agrees, noting that even if they move away, the ogres will likely keep following. In his mind, though, he admits this is exactly what he wants, though he's sure Jitri will scold him later. Nox tells himself he needs more ogres to increase his lifespan and that they'll soon need the ogres for something else. As he looks up the sky, he smiles, anticipating what's to come. Elsewhere, we see something happening underground, with the earth beginning to crack. Finally, Nox tells Jitri they should pack up and get ready to move. Deeper in the forest, we see an ogre walking calmly until something approaches it from behind. Before it can turn, the ground beneath it collapses and all that's left is its ketchup spilling out. Riding his horse, our protagonist reflects that it's already the second day and he's successfully familiarized himself with the terrain. He thinks to himself that Chaders is still far away, which is somewhat concerning, but everything is going smoothly. Suddenly, his brother approaches on horseback to speak with Nox. Rain asks what he intends to do about the ogres following them, questioning if he really has a plan. Nox, with confidence in his gaze, promptly replies that he does. He explains that they could kill the ogres, but doing so would attract other monsters, so it's better to focus on leaving the forest quickly. And finally, he mentions that the ogres will no longer be a problem if they manage to escape, but Grain seems reluctant upon hearing all of this, as he didn't trust Nox. The boy promptly complains while thinking that suddenly, his brother had taken command of the soldiers without him noticing and was being praised by everyone. Suddenly, one of the soldiers approaches young Master Nox and asks why the boy kept hitting the ground with that branch. And for some reason, our protagonist reveals that he was doing it because monsters could appear at any moment. All the other soldiers, upon hearing the word monster, become completely frightened, not knowing what was lurking nearby. Before Nox could say more about it, the ground beneath the horses begins to tremble. Jitri, in this situation, is completely scared, not knowing what she should do. Something starts cracking the ground and emerges from beneath, revealing itself. But, on the other hand, Nox seems actually quite excited, claiming that here it came, the worm. Then, from under the ground, a grotesque creature with a completely disgusting mouth and no eyes, similar to a demogorgon, appears. Nox explains that the worm is a monster that resembles both a worm and a serpent, and an inner lunatic. It is known as a malformed dragon. The boy comments that because of this, that gigantic creature couldn't use magic, but it was still quite famous for being very strong. Since even if dozens of ogres came running towards it, the worm would still be the hardest monster to defeat. But, in truth, Nox was very eager about that monster while thinking about the things he could gain from defeating it. The young man mentions that the soldiers would probably be shocked if they found out he was trying to lure the worm to the surface by hitting the ground. Then at that moment, he orders all his people to hide quickly in the bushes. The soldiers are completely confused by that decision as they were getting ready to attack. The only thing Nox says to himself is that the enemy of his enemy is actually his friend. Then we return to the moment when he told his brother Grain that in fact the ogres wouldn't be a problem. Suddenly, a huge rumble occurs, as if several people were running in one direction, and the soldiers become startled. At that moment, Nox reveals that he never intended to get rid of those ogres from the start, and thus an army of them can be seen approaching. Jitri is completely confused and warns the young master about the approach of those creatures. Nox, on the other hand, just says that the girl doesn't need to worry as he actually has a plan. Our protagonist asks his servant if the girl knew which monsters the worm both loves and hates at the same time. The girl becomes even more confused, but before she can say anything, the ground trembles, and she moves closer to Nox. At that moment, the young man reveals that the monster the worm most hated and loved were the ogres, and so, battle between the two species begins. The boy explains that ogres are the worm's primary source of food but are always seeking revenge, so both are basically enemies. And that's why skilled adventurers know very well how to use this information. The worm, with its extremely odd mouth, lunges at one of the ogres, immobilizing and immediately finishing it off. However, at that moment, other creatures start attacking that gigantic monster. And finally, everyone realizes what was happening and sees that the monsters were attacking each other. Grain, who was hiding in the bushes, becomes completely irritated, wanting to know how Nox knew something like that. Jitri, confused, asks her master if they should just wait now. Meanwhile, the creatures continue in their fierce battle, but for some reason, Nox picks up a stone and throws it. This stone hits one of the ogres, and the boy continues doing this to several of them. Confused, Jitri questions what her young master is doing and asks if he didn't know the ogres might attack. The worm then defeats more of its arch-enemies, and at that moment, our protagonist's strength begins to increase and his life is extended as well. The boy mentally apologizes to his servant and states that he needed to cause damage to the ogres at least once to gain XP. In the blink of an eye, the battle ends, and finally the worm defeats all its enemies. Grain comments that his brother did well in using the ogres, but in the end, those creatures lost and he asks what they should do. The young man says that it will be very difficult to kill the worm, and for him to escape, he urgently needed to take action. Suddenly, and without hesitation, Nox stands up and orders all his people to prepare for battle. The boy comments that his vassals could throw spears or flaming arrows into the monster's mouth. Without hesitation, the soldiers rise and promptly begin to follow Nox. Thus, the battle begins and everyone starts firing projectiles toward the mouth of that worm. The monster recoils a bit after so many attacks, and at that moment, Nox draws his sword and states that now it's his turn. He activates his powerful ability Genius Time and begins to see everything in slow motion. Time practically stops, and all the projectiles in the air are frozen. In the blink of an eye, our protagonist charges toward his enemy to put an end to that battle. He leaps into the air, heading for the monster's mouth, which was practically paralyzed. With extreme agility, he delivers several slashes toward the worm and then lands on the ground as his ability deactivates. The monster, before anyone could see what had happened, is completely sliced and shredded, and at that moment, the system notifies that Nox's life has been extended by 10 days. The creature's body falls beside our protagonist, and seeing how much time he gained, the young man comments that it was much more than he expected. He also mentions that he thinks it was pretty good for a medium-sized monster, but that if it weren't for the ogres, they wouldn't have managed to kill that creature. Nox's stamina reaches 5, and the effect of his Blessing of Evolution trait disappears. The boy then mentions that along with the curse and the weakness, he also ended up losing the Blessing of Evolution. But on the other hand, he finally managed to reach the much-desired 5 in stamina. 2 soldiers approach our protagonist, asking if the boy had gotten hurt anywhere, but Nox replies no and congratulates his comrades. All the soldiers begin to praise the young master, saying that he was truly amazing. However, proud as he was, the boy merely responds that it was nothing and that they should reorganize. But on the other hand, once again, the ground starts to crack in one place. Confused, Nox is completely frightened, and at that moment, another worm emerges. Our protagonist is very scared, not understanding why there were more of those worms there. Suddenly, an unknown figure appears and, in the blink of an eye, manages to slice that worm in half. We see that this person had white hair and wore a monocle. Nox, still shaken by the whole situation, wonders what that was. And looking at that unknown being, he questions why that person is there. That person lands on top of the worm's body, and Nox calls him the Sword Genius. Our protagonist thinks that this character was the strongest in Inner Lunatic and is Celsus' student and one of the 3 Sword Emperors alongside Theo. And his name was Paracelsus. Then at that moment, the genius tells Grain that he just saved him and yet received no thanks. Nox keeps staring at him and simply thinks that Paracelsus, besides that, hates nobles with all his might. Schultz calls Paracelsus a disgrace and reckless, questioning if the boy didn't know who Grain was. The sword genius simply apologizes and Schultz questions who he was. The boy introduces himself as Paracelsus and states that they can just consider him a mercenary. Nox comments to himself that because of what he went through when he was younger, it's understandable why he hates nobles so much. But his more important problem was that the first encounter with Paracelsus was supposed to happen at the Elden Academy. The boy questions what happened and what he should do while staring at that being. Sometime later, we see the soldiers, Grain and Nox, along with Paracelsus riding on horseback toward the city of Chaders. Nox's brother questions if Paracelsus was really a mercenary and finally asks if the boy was also heading to Chaders, just like them. However, he replies yes, as that would be his first stop, and he heard it was a great place to hunt monsters. Our protagonist says to himself that on second thought, Paracelsus traveled all across the Empire, and so he could advance in his training before classes began. Grain tells the boy that he seemed quite confident in his skills and asks if he was also traveling alone. The young man suggests that Paracelsus join his command to subdue monsters and claims he's sure he'll pay him well. Paracelsus says that since Grain and Nox were the sons of Theo von Rainharbor, one of the Sword Emperors, he admitted he was curious to see their skills. Schultz, irritated, questions how the boy dares to speak in such a rude manner, but Grain asks his subordinate to relax and says he'll give Paracelsus time to think. In his mind, the young man thinks that Paracelsus managed to take down the worm with a single blow, so he needed the boy by his side. And with a malicious expression, he states that this is how he'll regain the soldier's attention since Nox was the center of attention at that moment. Sometime later, we see a small town with a few people. Nox informs his brother that they finally arrived, while thinking that this was indeed Chaders. Looking at the number of people there, the boy notes that the town seemed even more deserted compared to what was in the game. Grain, glancing around, sees that the town was quite run down with various rats wandering about. A peasant child approaches and asks the noble if he could get something to eat. However, the boy acts disdainfully and just walks past the girl, ignoring her. Nox also ignores her, and Paracelsus seems uncomfortable with her attitude. Suddenly, a tall man with long hair approaches our protagonist's group. The man introduces himself as Tegan and states that he is the head of security for that village. He mentions that they must be Lords Grain von Rainharbor, who graduated from the academy, and Nox, the younger brother. Tegan also states that he was informed beforehand that the two would be coming there for their investigation mission. Paracelsus comments that this encounter with the sons of a sword emperor from Rainharbor was impressive. He had high expectations when he heard that the proud family would personally come to Chaders for a subjugation mission. But although Nox managed to handle the worm with a somewhat decent sword technique, he thought the two were still just spoiled young masters. And observing Nox, the young man comments that the two were a disappointment. He remarks that once again the town fails to function properly as the Night Order is busy diverting the people's money to fill their own bellies. Moreover, the citizens are unable to defend their position against an order of monsters and would be satisfied just to have something to eat. Tegan then says that since it's already late, he'll explain the mission details tomorrow and Nox and Grain should rest from their long journey at the inn. All the soldiers begin unpacking and tying up the horses. Meanwhile, Paracelsus approaches Grain and starts talking about the earlier proposal. The boy gets excited, thinking that the genius was going to become one of his subordinates, but the young man responds that he won't accept the proposal. The spoiled boy questions the young man about what he intends to do. Furthermore, he asks if Paracelsus plans to fight against an order of monsters alone. Paracelsus replies that he will first act according to what he had already planned, but before that, he wanted a safe subjugation for Grain. Finally, the young man states that if a person is skilled, they can do well anywhere, and that's how the world works. Nox, seeing the young man's action, thinks that they might meet again sooner than expected. Night finally falls over the small town. In his room, Nox tells Jitri that they should rest as they'll be leaving early the next day. He finally closes his room door while gazing at the simple window there. The boy walks up to it and looking outside, he sees the child who had asked him for food earlier with other children, sitting by a fire. The little girl was beside another boy who seemed to be her brother, practically lying down. Suddenly, Nox goes up to them and asks the three if they'd like something to eat. The boy opens a leather bag, revealing that it held some bread. He starts distributing it, telling the children they can take it without fear. The girl from earlier, crying with emotion, asks if this was really real. Our protagonist in his mind states that he couldn't save everyone, so he saw this as just a display of kindness and generosity. The girl begins to thank our protagonist, while Nox thinks that he wants to create a future where those children don't have to beg for food. But for that to happen, he first had to survive Chaders. Jitri, who was behind a wall observing the scene, thinks that she knew this would happen since Nox had just been acting tough before. While walking through the village with Nox and Grain, Tegan says that, as they may already know, the southern region of Chaders typically becomes infested with monsters during the winter, and that is why they always request funds and reinforcements from the imperial family to help them. Grain then, while looking at the walls, asks if those things are meant to protect the village, and Tegan says yes, but they've been there for a long time and need some repairs. We then see that the fences around the town were completely worn out from monster attacks. Nox, while walking around, thinks that it won't last even an hour before being destroyed when the wave of monsters begins. The boy also explains that being just a subchapter, it was his choice whether he would save that village or not, and most of the time, he chose to save Chaders. And in fact, the reason was quite obvious, as that town had high value and the future would become a very expensive piece of land. At that moment, Tegan remembers something and comments that there was something different about the monsters that year, as the number of furious monsters had increased significantly. Upon hearing this, our protagonist thinks that these people still don't know, but in reality, having more furious monsters would help them later. While still touring the town, Tegan reveals that, in fact, the worst part was that some villagers had also seen a griffin. Upon hearing this, all the soldiers are shocked, including Grain, and the boy comments that a griffin indeed made the situation more severe. He asks Tegan where this creature was seen, and the man quickly responds that it was near the wilderness. While Nox thinks that one of the most important factors in this subjugation of Chaders is whether they will be able to drive that griffin away or not. Since this monster was the king of the wilderness, and it was designed to be stopped, but confidently, the young man states that his goal was to put an end to that monster. A little outside the town, Tegan reveals that this was the wilderness of the Infinite Horizon. Moreover, that area was connected to the east of Tahalan, a neutral zone, and was quite famous for being a barren land. Nox speaks his first words of the day and says that there was something strange going on there. He reveals that griffins usually don't stay near the town of Chaders and generally remain in Tahalan, so the boy asks if Tegan knows why they are here. For some reason, the young man leading the tour and Ron seem extremely uncomfortable and surprised by that question. Our protagonist in his mind comments that he had a good suspicion of who the traitor was that would stab him in the back during that subjugation and the side quest started. In other words, first he would try to cut off most of the rot from the village to begin his main objective. In a house in Chaders, we see someone reading some papers. This person, completely irritated, crumples one of the papers for no apparent reason. We see that it was Schultz, who was saying that at first he didn't care about Nox because he heard he was just a useless brat, but because of him, he lost favor with Grain. Irritated, the young man states that he worked hard to get Grain's favor and wouldn't let Nox get away with this and would punish the boy in any way he could. Jitri begins to descend the stairs and Schultz seems quite interested in the girl, seeing an opportunity for revenge. He watches the girl with a malicious expression while recalling her name. The young man states that he found out she was a peasant. Then suddenly, he stands up and slams his hand against the wall behind the girl. As the jerk that he was, the young man with his other hand grabs the girl's hand, pulling her closer. Jitri, completely confused and scared, asks if Schultz wants something from her. The chubby boy comments that yes, and that in fact he wanted many things, but it wasn't anything serious. He just wanted to have a conversation with the servant, just the two of them. However, Jitri, not being naive, quickly pulls her hand back, freeing herself. Still bothered, the girl comments that she had nothing to discuss with Schultz in particular. Irritated, Grain's butler says that there was nothing wrong with that since, even though he was a knight in service to his master, he also deserved a little fun. And this also applied to the servant. Then he places his hand on the girl's shoulder, harassing her. At that moment, Jitri, in her mind, thinks that if she rejects the advances of that guy now, young Master Nox will fall into disgrace with young Master Grain, and he might get into trouble and attract unnecessary attention from the family. Furthermore, she didn't want her young master to suffer in any way. That's why, even unwillingly, the girl begins to give in. Schultz, furious, says that, thanks to the girl's master, all the efforts he made for 10 years went down the drain, and he was going to make Jitri repay him. Suddenly, Nox arrives and comments that Schultz probably wanted something in exchange, and that he would pay personally. Then the boy separates Jitri from Schultz. The way he does this is anything but pleasant, as Nox rips the chubby boy's arm off. With a malicious expression and his bloodied sword in hand, the boy questions Schultz how he wanted to be rewarded. On the ground, the chubby boy is completely desperate, questioning what the boy was doing and then claiming that even he wouldn't be able to escape the consequences of this. Furious, Schultz asks Nox if he thinks young Master Grain will just stand by and let this pass. With an even more terrifying expression, Nox asks if Schultz was threatening him with his own brother. This time, the boy rips off the other hand of his enemy, leaving him in utter despair. With his arm and now his hand severed, the boy begins screaming in pain. He places his hands on the ground to support himself and admits he was wrong, even though Nox comes from a powerful family. Our protagonist doesn't let himself be shaken and retorts that even though he comes from a powerful family, it's not him who doesn't know his place, it's Schultz. At that moment, the boy ends Schultz's life, piercing him in the back. Jitri, completely shocked by the scene, says that her young master Nox did something wrong and that Master Grain wouldn't let this go. Suddenly, Schultz's boss arrives in the room, questioning his brother what the hell was going on. Desperate, he can't believe Nox really just killed his subordinate and butler. Without hesitation, our protagonist simply replies that it's exactly what he did, and Grain asks how he dared. He yells at his brother's face, stating that a useless person like him shouldn't have the audacity to say he's the one responsible for killing his knight. Unshaken, Nox simply says that his brother has misunderstood the situation and that you should ask him for the details of what happened first. But Grain, completely enraged, grabs his brother by the collar to try and intimidate him. He gets closer to Nox and asks why the boy killed his butler, then states that if he doesn't provide a reasonable explanation, he won't let him get away unpunished. The young man then reveals that Schultz tried to sexually assault his servant, and as her master, he couldn't just stand by and watch that scene like a child. Grain seems to handle that poorly and says that the servant was just a peasant. However, Nox starts emitting a powerful aura and questions what his brother just said and if he could take responsibility for this. With a terrifying expression, he grabs Grain's hand, pulling it away from his collar, and the boy is completely intimidated by his brother's power. Grain thinks that, in fact, his useless little brother was quite talented, and he can't believe it. The boy steps back and says that Nox should at least have reported this to him first, but the boy replies that he was the family's famous useless one. In other words, he wasn't used to doing things like reports or waiting. That's why he suggests that the two leave the problem for their father to solve after they return home. Grain becomes completely irritated, realizing that his brother wanted something from him, and responds that he'll leave the decision for when they return home. With a smile on his face, the little white-haired boy replies that it was a great choice, and at that moment he calls for his servant. The two leave the room while his brother watches Nox leaving, wondering when he became so strong. Confused, Grain also thinks that, in fact, that sword his brother was holding he had seen somewhere before. Finally, the boy states that he couldn't underestimate Nox during that mission in any way. Nox, outside next to Jitri, thinks that there will be a huge mess among the soldiers, since they've already separated into factions and are now at a crossroads where they need to make a decision. That decision was whether to follow Grain or follow Nox, something the soldiers will probably fight among themselves to decide. Looking at his servant, the boy notices that Jitri is shaking for some reason. He asks the girl if everything is okay, but with a tearful voice, she replies that it is. Turning around, she asks if her master will really be okay. With tears streaming down her face, she questions why Nox did that, as if this issue intensifies, he will make even more enemies. Moreover, he will be in danger again if that happens, and basically, it will all be her fault. Offended, our protagonist questions if Jitri still didn't know what kind of master she had. After all, he was the useless one from the Rand Harbor family, so it didn't matter where they were. Jitri should never lower her head to anyone. Wiping the tears from her eyes, the girl promptly agrees and says she will remember that. Soon after, we see someone who was drinking in their room placing the cup on the table. Irritated, Grain questions how that useless person dared to try and go over him. The boy reports that Nox was very different from what he had imagined. Moreover, that sword was very strange, and it was probably just a coincidence that it looked like his father's sword. The boy comments that he needed to keep an eye on Nox, but now that he had lost Schultz, he didn't know who he could trust to watch his brother. Ron enters the room and mentions that the situation on the first floor had already been resolved. But something bothered him, as young Master Nox was completely the opposite of the rumors they had heard. Granny, looking at the man, thinks that Nox wasn't the only one who was different there, as the man was supposed to be the captain of a night order that had done a lot of work in the area. That's why the boy asks how Nox, who only studied from books, knew that place better than Ron, and why he didn't pay all that money for such a sloppy job. The boy then concludes that since the wave of monsters hasn't started yet, he will use the man's night orders for just a little longer. The young man then asks Ron to make sure to get rid of the monsters and bandits in the neighborhood, and if Nox starts acting strangely, to inform him immediately. The head of the Knights promptly responds that he understands and soon begins to leave the room. A short time later, we see Jitri asking her master what he had done during the day. The girl also asks if, by any chance, he went to check the village walls, and Nox, while analyzing a potion, replies that he did, since they could barely stand. His servant asks how they are going to stop the monster wave, and the boy responds that they should go to a certain place. Jitri, confused, asks where they were going since their inn was on the other side. Our protagonist just replies that he was thinking of recruiting someone new for his team, remembering that even here it was possible to find someone excellent. In his mind, Nox reveals that this character was Alina, someone he recruited every time he came to Chaders, and she was a genius at making potions. This meant that she was a potion maker, a witch who makes potions to make a living. Hooded, Jitri and Nox walk through the city in a certain direction. The girl, confused, asks if there really was a genius potion maker hiding in such a rundown place. The boy promptly replies that there is, and Jitri states that she didn't understand, since if she was so talented, she shouldn't be hiding in such a remote corner. Nox simply replies that Alina probably has her reasons, while thinking that the reason is that this is the hidden route to complete the Chaders arc. Because in the future, Alina will be working for another empire instead of Arkheim. And if the player doesn't complete Chaders with that hidden route, they will never find Alina again. Heading toward an isolated part near the city's sewers, Nox asks Jitri to follow him and watch where she steps to avoid falling. Jitri simply agrees, but in her mind, she wonders if there really was a person of that level hiding here. As they walk through those dark corridors, suddenly a light turns on and Jitri quickly becomes alert. We see a girl drinking inside her house while refusing to believe that she was stuck in this dead-end world. Sitting in a chair while drinking, the girl wonders how she ended up like this. Until suddenly our protagonist with Jitri arrives and catches the girl red-handed. He simply says that he found her, thinking that this would be his potion maker. Alina, completely startled, screams in fear while questioning who those two people were, and why the hell there were other people in that place, and Jitri seems incredulous that there really was someone there. The servant tells her master that the genius potion maker he mentioned was actually just a drunk. A while later, we see Alina apologizing, saying that she had no idea Nox and Jitri came from such a respected family. The boy simply replies that it's fine and says, changing the subject, that he was there because he needed to tell Alina something, so she should pay attention. In his mind, he thinks that the girl was a character with the most potential for development, a talented potion maker, and he needed to get her. Even so, she had some flaws, so he activates the information system about her. We see that Alina's negative point is that she is an alcoholic, and some of her skills are dormant. Irritated, he thinks that this was to be expected, while questioning which talented characters the useless one from the family would manage to recruit. Of course none, let alone a genius potion maker. He then tells Alina that she's a bit of a problem, but they have no choice, and she simply says that she doesn't know why, but she wants to apologize if she made him angry. Jitri calls for her young master and says that she knows she's going over the line with what she's about to say, but she doesn't think hiring that alcoholic is a very wise decision. Nox replies that he knew that too, but they were out of options, and Jitri simply accepts the choice. Returning to the subject, Alina says that she wants to know why they came to find her in such a place. Our protagonist then answers that he will get straight to the point and asks Alina to join him and his group. The boy also mentions that if she follows him, he will give her whatever she needs. Alina starts trembling, very tempted to accept the offer, while Nox just observes. However, the drunk girl apologizes and says she couldn't accept his offer, as she had something she needed to do. Nox, with audacity, questions if this thing she needed to do has anything to do with her friend May. The drunk girl asks how the boy knew about that, and our protagonist replies that soon May would be executed. However, if Alina accepted his offer, he might even save May. And with a malicious expression, he asks if he's made the girl change her mind with that opportunity. At her house near the sewer, Alina was thinking that soon her friend May would be executed. She remembers what our protagonist said about helping the girl, and that tempts her. Alina starts remembering that May was her first and only friend who always rebelled against those who collected taxes. The girl never held back in opposing Tegan when he wanted to extort more from the poor in the village, and that's why she got caught. Crying, Alina thinks that she would prefer if they had taken her instead of May, and if she had been more aggressive at the time, maybe her friend would be safe. In tears, the girl also tells herself that she couldn't rescue her friend, and she probably doubts Nox will save her, and she questions if the boy will even try to help May, but she doesn't think she'll be able to forget about this for a long time. Elsewhere, we see a tavern with many people drinking. Ron was drinking wine, completely relaxed in that place. Suddenly, one of his subordinates questions what Grain was like to his superior. The man then answers coldly that he was just an idiot. Moreover, they were only pretending to act like a night order and Grain had fallen for the plan. One of his lackeys says that, although it was a coincidence, it was worth it to have raided the night order's place, Ron, since they even managed to get a pendant that could be used for even bigger jobs. Ron then adds that if they show the badge to the Rand Harbor family, they'll think he is the captain of the Night Order, Ron, and because of that, he would receive benefits. One of his colleagues comments that even with things happening by coincidence, it's interesting that their boss's name is the same as Ron's. Ron then says that if they take Grain hostage, they will probably make a huge amount of money from the ransom since it's the Rand Harbor family they are talking about. One of these soldiers seems somewhat bothered and suspicious, and the boy questions if everything will be okay. He mentions that among the 3 Shadow families, Rand Harbor is the most influential, and he wonders if anyone has ever survived after messing with him. But as soon as he says this, everyone celebrating becomes extremely uncomfortable. They start calling the boy a coward and saying that's why others called him an idiot. Ron tells all of his colleagues to shut up and then questions what the little boy thinks this place is. The chief comments that they are in Chaders and even the Imperial family abandoned that dump. In other words, they were going to make Grain a hostage, take the ransom money, and then head back to the east. And no matter how influential the Rand Harbor family is, they couldn't do anything in a hostile nation surrounded by sand. The false Ron then comments that after seeking refuge there, they just need to enjoy a life of luxury, and with that, everyone congratulates their captain. However, the boy who was scared reports that this time that brat named Nox was with them, and he could probably realize the deception. The false Ron retorts that the boy was indeed dangerous as he had a persistent personality, so everyone should know not to get involved with Nox. Ron agrees, saying they should just keep drinking. Suddenly, the candles that were lighting the place go out and darkness spreads throughout the tavern. The captain's 2 subordinates question what happened and who blew out the candles. The false Ron tells his men to stay calm, but suddenly blood flies onto his face. As he wipes the mess off his hand, he looks at it and wonders what the hell that was. Looking to the side, the man sees his bowl-cut friend without his head and panics, not understanding what was happening. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.